Your requests were heard. We have Zach Masek on already again on the Redacted Culture Cast because we had a conversation recently about the history of special operations as well as history itself as a study and the Green Berets and a sense of a loss of mission or purpose and how that's being reflected in the special operations community right now. And just as much as you, the audience, noticed that we got into the meat and potatoes about halfway through the last show, this is that much expected part 2. So, Zach, even for those who missed the first episode, go ahead and introduce yourself briefly, and then we'll jump right into where we left off.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a little bit of background. I jumped into the Army in 2008. Originally, I had an option 40 contract. I was supposed to go to Ranger Battalion. 11 X-ray turned 11 Charlie Mortarman, and then had the opportunity, got asked to go try out for Special Forces, went and did that, became an 18 Delta, did some time in Afghanistan. I was down in 7th Group, and then after the rotation got out, I decided to go back to college. I was fortunate enough to make it into Columbia University, which is a really interesting experience. And then simultaneously, I jumped into 20th Group, did some work with them for a while, graduated school, and then did some contracting work, so to speak, for a little while, and then kind of got out completely, family-related stuff, and I'm on to bigger, better things, I suppose. So that's kind of where I'm at. That's a little bit of my background.
Yeah. So our conversation that we had, one of the things that we were getting into was this. We were talking about Robert Rogers, and Robert Rogers he's this legendary character in a lot of American special operations. I remember being a private, and so this is kind of what started our talk. Was you and I have a very similar timeline when it comes to education, military experience, but I went the Ranger route, you went the Green Beret route,
right?
and it was interesting to hear that the Green Berets also called back to Robert Rogers. And as much as special operations is identity based, that's ours. You can't have our guy, right?
yeah.
Like that dude's he's my guy. You can't have him, right? You can't claim.
He is your guy for sure.
So I mean, Robert Rogers, 19 standing orders, Rogers Rangers, whatever the rules of ranging. But I digress. However. You produce a channel, it's Dead Warrior Society that does long form historical, I would say depictions, or you do a longer form content on the history of different characters, whether it's Sparta, Rome, or Sparta, or special operations, and you went really heavy into Robert Rogers. So let's start with the St. Francis raid, and what was the military significance of that, and then what was the historical significance of that, where he takes 200 men, and we use words like raid oftentimes, but what does that mean? Where are we going from here? Now, I'm very excited to announce the first official sponsor of the Redacted Culture Cast. Obsidian Arms is one of those companies that reflects the many facets of gun culture. Not only are their firearms frequently found on competition fields like USPSA and 3-Gun, but they are a Minnesota-based, US-sourced original equipment manufacturer. Obsidian Arms makes their own punch and tool kits for the amateur and professional gunsmith out of Little Canada, Minnesota, that come with a lifetime warranty. Whether it is fine parts that require a Swiss machine, or you're in the design phase and are looking for an American machine shop that is in tune with the needs of gun culture, go check out Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Thank you, and now back to the show.
It was towards the end of the war, and quite frankly, essentially what was happening...
The French and Indian War?
The French and Indian War, but I think what's really important to understand is the French and Indian War was one theater of war in a much larger, frankly, global war. So we sort of disassociate the two, but really it's all part of the same thing. And what was happening, it was the 7 Years' War between the French and the English, and really, and Winston Churchill highlighted this actually. He actually said that the 7 Years' War was the first true world war. And then what he meant by that was the entire globe was associated with this war. and the French had a bunch of allies, the English had a bunch of allies. And so the French and Indian War, particularly from our backgrounds, it's so fascinating. We are sort of taught that there was this conflict in North America between the French and the English. And at least for me, I believed or was led to believe that it was this isolated conflict, like I said, in North America. But in actuality, it was a global conflict. And in North America, it was the sort of the tail end conflict of a much longer war that had sort of taken place on and off throughout the 17th century and then into the 18th century. And so this was like the showdown. This was the final effort between the French and the English. What's really fascinating, and I'm going to get to the raid here in a second, was that, you know, like you said, Green Berets perceive Robert Rogers' experience to be like one of the first true UW situations, because Robert Rogers worked, again, buzzwords, by, with, and through Native Americans, and therefore it was an SF mission. This is simply not the case. Robert Rogers did indeed use or leverage Native Americans, specifically two groups. They were known as the Stockbridge Indians and then the Mohawk Native Americans or Indians that worked with him in a fraction of his force. And it kind of changed on and off, but fundamentally it was like approximately, I would say, 1/5 of his ranging force was made up of either one of those two groups. Paradoxically, the French were actually the ones who were conducting the true, what we would talk about as sort of consider as the Green Beret mission. And what I mean is that the French, you would have one or two partisan, is what they referred to their sort of officers as, that were conducting these paramilitary asymmetrical warfare operations. And then you would have like hundreds of Indians. So they were truly had the bulk of their force were Native Americans. Versus on the English side, at least at this point in the war or the conflict between the French and the English, you had guys like Robert Rogers and his Rangers, but the vast majority of his Rangers were made up of a whole host of European immigrants, colonists. So you had the Ulster Irish, you had Scottish, you had Welsh, you had English, and then a fraction of that was indeed Native Americans. And so essentially what had happened in the region of Lake Champlain, Lake George, was this conflict between British forces and French forces. And it was honestly as much of a naval sort of amphibious war as it was a land war. So what ended up happening was they had these forts, both the French and the English, all throughout this region between Vermont, what is now New York, and then Canada. And these, when you're reading the history, and it took me a while to sort of tap into this, these forts were just essentially forward operation bases, as you and I, you know, they're FOBs. And so you would have all your men, materiel, this is where you would plan your missions, this is where you would launch missions. And at the end of the day, the British wanted to knock out all of the French forts and create, again, using modern terminology, more white space, right? Pushing them back into Canada. And at first, they needed a group to gather intelligence so they could figure out, okay, how are we going to plan large siege assaults on forts? And the only real way to take a fort at that time was utilizing a variety of things, but predominantly it was artillery, it was cannons. But in order to move cannons and all the artillery pieces across this wilderness landscape, you had to cut roads. It was tedious, it was cumbersome, it was difficult. And they also had to see what the enemy was doing, what their numbers were, how, you know, what their capabilities were. And so at first, they wanted to leverage the Native Americans, but for, again, a long story short, the originally in like the early stages of the war, they were using the Mohawk, but the Mohawk had been devastated in this one particular battle. And so they basically just left. And the British high command was essentially only left with Robert Rogers. And they sort of grabbed him and they were like, hey, go conduct a reconnaissance on this fort over here and just tell us what you find. And what's truly incredible is he was so good at his job and effectively what we would refer to today as long-range reconnaissance missions, that the British actually, when he brought back the intelligence, they didn't even believe him. They were like, "This can't. There's no way you could have gotten this good of intelligence. There's like you're claiming that you were right on top of the fort. That's impossible. Like the Mohawk couldn't do that. You know, you're giving us really precise numbers. There's just no way this is real." And then over the course of the war, they realized like, oh my God, like actually everything he's saying is right. He has a capability that we weren't able to tap into previously prior to his sort of arrival. And one thing I do want to mention is that since I produced all these episodes, a lot of individuals have come out and said, you know, there were other Rangers prior to Robert Rogers. They existed in the wars previously in the 17th century. All of this is absolutely true. Robert Rogers and the men he worked with were by no means the first Rangers at all. But the point that I try to make, and I don't think I do a very good job, is that Robert Rogers standardized the sort of special operations TTPs, you know, tactics, techniques, procedures that Rangers were utilizing at that time. Simultaneously, he was able to integrate what he was doing with the conventional British forces. All of that was a first. And Rangers previously had done similar operations and they were super effective, but they weren't able to do or standardize all the things that he did. And the fact that, again, as you noted, his rules of ranging are still in use to this day, sort of crystallizes that idea that, again, that he really was able to standardize all the stuff that he was doing. By the time the St. Francis raid was taking place, they had actually planned this operation years prior to it being executed. And it was something that Robert Rogers wanted to do. But for a variety of reasons, the British High Command, they just weren't interested. By 1759, he was essentially able to convince the British High Command that they had created enough white space that it was indeed time to go execute this mission. Coupled with this reality is the fact that the Abenaki, which was the native band that were living in St. Francis at that time, were I would say, the tip of the spear for the French. The Abenaki were absolutely devastating in that war in particular, but even for the last 100 years, the Abenaki were super aggressive. Essentially, you would have French officers and leaders and partisans who would say, hey, we're not really in like a full-on conflict with the British, but they're beginning to intrude on your lands. They're pushing the boundaries of their civilization further north into Canada, and they're becoming more of a nuisance, more of a threat. And so they would deploy raiding parties of Abenaki all throughout the early 18th century. And so pretty much every ranger that was on the St. Francis raid had either faced or fought Abenaki, or more specifically, their fathers, the generation before them, had been attacked, assaulted, raided by parties of Abenaki all throughout North America. And so there was certainly an aspect of it where they wanted vengeance. So that was definitely part of it. But the other part of it too was the British really wanted to prove that, they had pushed, they had sort of, they had been so successful that they could actually deploy or mobilize and deploy Rangers deep and penetrate deep into the Canadian landscape and strike behind enemy lines, which would have been, an absolute first. No one had ever done anything like this. I mean, it was completely revolutionary just in terms of the scale, right? Like you mentioned, there were roughly 200 men. There's sort of a debate. Historians argue it started with 200 men. It's 190 men. But what's absolutely crazy to me is it was an 8-week mission, which like when I hear that, I think of the times when I was in like, when I would go on missions in Afghanistan, when I was in training in small unit tactics, which is sort of like a rip on Ranger School, like it's a baby Ranger School, so to speak, kind of. But, and the only reason I say that is because when you're in small unit tactics in the Q course, the Ranger handbook is the Bible. Everybody has one. We're looking through it. We're reading it. We're using it to do our our warnos and our fragos and planning missions and so on and so forth. And so it was, when they pushed into the region and the difficulties they were able to overcome were absolutely miraculous. I mean, just on the infill alone, within just a few days, they had guys that got really sick. There was some sort of illness. We don't really know what it was. And then there was an incident where a couple guys got blown up. And so within like the first few days of the mission, they lost 25% of their force.
Which in our contemporary era would be mass casualty and mission inoperable. Like
exactly. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And this is one of the things I mentioned in the show is during the infill, if this was a mission that took place today, like you said, and you lost 25% of your force, all right, we'll do this again. Let's go back. Let's regroup. Let's replan, whatever. And Robert Rogers was just like, no, we're going to continue with the mission. We got enough guys. We're good to go.
Yeah. So I want to jump in on a couple of these because I have a couple more questions that specifically center on about Robert Rogers. And one of them is that you said he standardized things. And it before we go into the philosophical conversation between, the irony of standardization and unconventional warfare, when did that happen? Did he like, it's not like he wrote a book and then it was definitive. It was like, what did this standardization look like? What was ranging before Rogers? What did the term come from? And then where did that standardization take place, or what were the steps, or how did it develop over time? Or perhaps how much of it is retroactive, where we say that because he always did an ambush the same way, he standardized it. When he did have his 19 standing orders, he did have these kind of iconic rules, which we would call basic soldiering, or effective soldiering is another term, which I think is an odd term because it's a term that I've heard recently that just kind of comes up, as in basic soldiering is a skill set different from shooting, different from marksmanship, different from accuracy, different from specialized skill sets, long range breaching, whatever, medical, whatever, that is very rare in other parts of the world. So where did let's go back to the thing on standardization. What was it? Where did this ranging thing come from? What did it look, or where did he standardize it? And then where did it go from there?
Yeah, this was honestly one of the major questions I had, and not to totally get off topic because it really ties up with everything we're talking about. And I'm going to make a big jump here. Bear with me. I was a huge Lord of the Rings fan when I was a kid, and Aragorn or Strider was a ranger. And then you obviously have the rangers that exist today. And there had to have been some sort of continuity in that concept, right? You had a fictitious character who was in a fictitious world who was a ranger, right? Like why did J.R.R. Tolkien refer to Aragorn or Strider, whatever you want to call him, as a ranger? And I decided that if I was going to find the answer to this question, I would have to look at like the quintessential sort of pseudo-American ranger, which of course is Robert Rogers. What is a ranger? A ranger simply is an individual or a group of individuals who have the capability or capacity to, first of all, they have a certain set of skills that the vast majority of individuals within sort of a military framework or paramilitary framework just don't have. It's almost something, at least before the modern era, that you had to grow up learning certain skills in order to just sort of accidentally become a ranger. And really, if I was to sum up what a ranger was, it's an individual who has a certain level of skill sets that he just picked up through his life, growing up, hunting in the wilderness, where now you're taking that guy who is comfortable in the most uncomfortable situations, typically by himself or with a small group, in uncharted territory. And you can essentially just grab him and say, hey, there's a bunch of bad guys over here. We have no idea what's happening. We need you to go out there, harass them, undermine what they're doing. And then we also need you to grab and, gather a bunch of intelligence about what's going on in this uncharted wilderness that we just don't know. And if we try to send the average, soldier or infantryman, they're going to get lost. They're going to die either to, enemies taking them over and killing them, or the wilderness itself is just going to destroy them. And so you could deploy these rangers out. And again, because they grew up, frankly, the sort of most important feature of a ranger is that he can go out in the wilderness and hunt. And all of Robert Rogers' rangers were these individuals who grew up on the frontier, who as young men, teenagers, children, were essentially sent out to set up traps, to hunt wild game, and could survive, had the skill set of being able to survive on their own. And so you could send them out and do all these things. And so that is essentially what a ranger is. They have a skill set that nobody else really has, and you can only get it if you grew up doing it.
So that skill set is in a measure self-sufficiency, land navigation.
Yes.
So okay. So in other words, they're frontiersmen in another
exactly sense. Precisely.
They're the combination of a soldier and a frontiersman, because I've read a couple books on it too. One of them was the First Way of War, which was a history or account of ranging. Is quite different than Black Hawk Down. It's not it's not a CQB heavy
direct action mission. Yeah, right. And that same goes, by the way, another really great sort of group that had that capability were the original Texas Rangers. So really where you see Rangers organically arising, so to speak, is on a frontier. So when you had these groups of cattlemen living on the frontier of what was sort of Texas territory, if you will, they were on horseback, so it was slightly different in terms of how they could get to and from a place. But again, they were going into uncharted territory. They had a unique skill set that they basically either taught themselves, or somebody who was living near them, a father, a neighbor, taught them by living on the frontier. And it was really a way of surviving. And so Robert Rogers, effectively, when he was enlisted, so to speak, he wasn't literally enlisted, he was actually an officer from the get-go, he already had all these skills, similarly to all the men that he would recruit. I mean, when he first started his first ranging company, this is where I get super amped because it's so cool.
Ranging LLC, like a company, or like he started
no, like a ranger company, like we would talk about like a company.
Stand up a unit, yep.
And this sort of, by the way, ties into the tragic sort of downfall of Robert Rogers. He was in a pinch. He was broke. He was in debt when he was a young man in his early 20s before the French and Indian War broke out. And one of the ways he was trying to make money was through criminal activity. And he was making, what's the term? Fake money, counterfeiting money.
Counterfeit money, yeah.
Yeah. He got indicted with his group, and they were going to essentially throw him in a jail cell. And he had this moment where he realized, okay, if I don't want to be a prisoner, if I don't want to be thrown in jail, what is something I can do to get me out of this sentence? And he was like, well, there's a war that's about to break out. It's inevitable. If I can make myself useful to the British and the militia, because there was a lot of militias at that time, and they were sort of organized in different territories and regions and colonies. He thought, if I can recruit X number of men, so many men in this company, then I'll be given a commission, and I can be useful to the British in this war. And so while he was waiting to get his jail sentence, he actually went out and basically went door to door and was like, hey, I got this idea. We're going to go work as Rangers for the British during this conflict that is upon us. Will you be one of my enlisted guys in this company? And actually, pretty quickly, he was able to enlist, I believe, 28 men. I want to say 3 or 4 of them were Native Americans. And the rule, so to speak, was if you were able to recruit, I believe it was 28 men, then you would almost automatically be given a commission as a captain. And so he did that. And literally overnight, I think he was 21, he just became a captain of this ranging company. And the British High Command was like, we could use this guy. Let's forego his sentence, the fact that he was breaking the law and counterfeiting money, and use him as a ranger because we're desperate. We need rangers. The Native American population, our allies, are unpredictable. They kind of move in waves with their community. So they pulled him in, and essentially it was really cool. So I believe he started his first ranging company in where he was indicted. I think it was in Massachusetts. And the governor of New Hampshire, who was, again, trying to prepare for this war in his area of operations, so to speak, got really upset with the Massachusetts governor. And he wrote him a letter just saying, hey, Robert Rogers is my guy. He recruited a bunch of guys from New Hampshire. You can't have him or his ranging company. Also, by the way, he's a criminal, so you shouldn't hire him anyways. And so he was able to basically wedge himself in between Robert Rogers and where he started his first ranging company. And then once he was able to decouple Robert Rogers and the Rangers from that sort of, I guess we would sort of call it like a National Guard almost, he then went to Rogers and was like, hey, I need you for our war front. Come up, bring your guys. I've got the British High Command here, and they want to talk to you. They want to use you for their operations. And so once that happened, he sort of started naturally, first he had to prove himself to the commander-in-chief that he was actually capable of what he was saying he was capable of, which did indeed take time. Like I said earlier, the first few missions, nobody believed him. Like everybody was like, this is bullshit. Like he's lying. He claims that he slept in the moat outside of a French fort overnight and then slipped out without anyone seeing him. Like this didn't happen. And it took a couple iterations to eventually the British were like, oh, wow, he's the real deal. He's actually doing what he says he's doing. His intelligence is accurate. And then as far as the standardization goes, it's hard to pin down. I'm sure there's a date, and I don't recall it, when he actually sat down and like wrote out his rules of ranging. But essentially, as the war progressed and he was able to recruit more men to his company, there were multiple companies. He had so many men that he didn't just have his original ranging company, he had multiple ranging companies. And as he was recruiting guys, they had to meet a certain level of skill set to join the ranger company. But then from there, he basically was like, hey, you met the qualification and we're going to bring you on this mission. You're going to do what we tell you to do, and you're just going to learn on the job. And that's basically how he was able to train the Rangers as they came on. And then through that process, he basically was like, this is the thing. Like there are actually rules that we utilize to stay alive on our operations, on our missions. And I can basically, I don't know if he actually thought of it this way, but he just sort of at one point was like, I'm going to standardize this stuff, right? Like when we get a new guy, this is the stuff that he needs to learn. Like what skills is he bringing? But then also, how do we translate this individual from, hey, I know you can hunt in the wilderness by yourself, but now this is a wartime. And so there's a slight pivot from hunting game or trapping game in the North American wilderness to, hey, you're working with a company size element or a squad size element, and we're going to go and ambush Native Americans We're going to capture French as they're going to and from their fort to gather intelligence. We'll interrogate them. And he talks about that in his rules of ranging of like, if we capture 1 or 2 or 3 guys, we're going to separate them and question them individually. And then we'll cross-reference their intel. And so if 2 guys are saying the same thing, then we know that's probably right. If they're telling us different things, then we need to reinterrogate them, little things like that. But it just sort of happened. It wasn't like there was a moment where he was like, okay, now we're going to get the memo and I'm going to send a memorandum out to every ranger. This is how we do business. It was more of like, we're getting new guys, we're training them. There is a system that we're using. Let's systematize this. And so he had lieutenants, right? There wasn't just him he was the commanding officer of the Rangers, but then he had individuals like John Stark, who was a lieutenant, eventually captain, and then a general during the Revolutionary War. And he had to go to his lieutenants and basically say, hey, I can't go on every op. In order to keep up with the operational tempo, I'm going to come back, you're going to go out, but we got this new guy. Here's how we're going to train him. Here's the system. Here are our rules of ranging. Make sure he meets all these standards. Ready, set, go.
He makes it repeatable, not so much predictable, but repeatable, so that the same skill set development can occur across multiple people. It's not just like I'm actually kind of defaulting to thinking about it almost in like video game terms, where it's you know what I mean? Like he's not.
That's right. Yeah.
It's like it's not. Was it? We'll go back in time to like Warcraft 3. He's recognizing that ranging is not something that a hero character does, something that's special. He wants to make it a repeatable thing, so that other people, so that it's not just, oh, I'm the guy, even though I think that from some accounts of him, he definitely wasn't known for his humility.
No,
right. But so that having this like, dark combination of he's really capable himself, but then also he's trying to make it repeatable so that others can join into the company and continue to use this method of development. Now, I've seen that continue in modern era, right? So we see like Ranger Battalion has an entrance portion now called RASP.
Yep.
And then you're really you're supposed to be developed by your leadership.
Yeah.
And so your immediate leadership, which is different than, say, getting a degree. Your professor doesn't become your professor does not hand you off. I guess in some places it might happen, but your professor doesn't really hand you off to your next team leader, who's then going to do all the OJT or on-job training. But we're starting to see that happen here. What were some of those standards that were expected of people trying to join the ranging companies back in the 1700s?
So a couple things. I would say initially when he first started his first company, you had to basically be a cookie cutter copycat of who he was, which is to say you had to have grown up on the frontier. You had to have dealt with Native Americans in some sort of skirmish militaristic capacity, so to speak. Like, it wasn't going to be your first time bumping into a raiding party.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big differences between a ranger during this time and I would say like your professional soldier was their skill set when it came to firearms.
Okay.
One of the things that the British didn't really care too much for was using too much resources. So marksmanship training was just not a thing as a professional British foot soldier. Like, you didn't do it. There was no time when you went out to a range and you set up targets and then you shot there and like fire, kind of like what we would do today with marksmanship training. On the flip side, rangers, because they grew up with their weapon systems, and again, when you were a ranger coming to a ranger company, you were expected to bring all of your equipment with you. It's not like today in the Army when you show up, and they're like, here's your uniform, here's your rifle, here's your rucksack, here's your night vision. When you joined the Rangers back then, there was a whole list of items that you essentially had to bring with you. And if for some reason, if you couldn't bring those with you, the Ranger companies had to give them to you. And so these are individuals, particularly in the beginning, who their rifle was their way of life. It was how they made their money. It was how they survived. And it's like, it's sort of like driving your car, or if you're some guy who goes to the gym and works out, like when you touch a barbell, you know the weight, you know how to balance it. You know, when you add weight on, what it feels like. You know, if I'm going to go do squats, I'm going to warm up with this amount of weight, and then when I get into my working sets, I'm going to add that. And like your body just intuitively knows, like, okay, I know what 225 is going to feel like. I know what 135 is going to feel like. It's that sort of familiarity with what they used to call the brown Bess.
The Brown Bess was the smooth bore musket of the British.
Yeah, and that was the primary weapon of the Rangers. These guys, literally from the time they were pre-teens, were handling these rifles. And so by the time they got to being in a Ranger company, utilizing, manipulating their rifles was just secondhand nature in a way that wasn't true with your ordinary infantry soldier for the British, you know, the British infantry, so to speak. So again, there was an expectation that you were an expert in this, and not to mention, you could also hit targets at a certain distance when you came to the ranging companies. And that skill set didn't translate over to your average foot soldier as a British foot soldier, infantryman, so to speak. And so, like I said, the original Rangers who came on had all these skill sets. And then as they progressed, more and more men, kind of like today, saw Robert Rogers, saw guys like John Stark, saw the guy, you know, the Rangers they were going on missions and the operations on. And a lot of these guys were like, hey, I want to be a Ranger. Like, that's cool. Like, those guys are badass. Like, I want to be a Ranger. And some of the later iterations of individuals who went and enlisted themselves in the ranging companies weren't necessarily the same type of guy that Robert Rogers was. They didn't necessarily have the skills. And so Robert Rogers, again, not so dissimilar from today, would basically go out and identify guys who maybe had the right personalities and 3 of the 10 skill sets he needed. And he was like, okay, you know what? You don't have everything I need, but you have the right personality. You're super motivated. I can teach you the rest. And most of it we're going to do on the job. And if we can't do it on the job, when we're back at the fort in our bivouac, because the Rangers had their own bivouac site adjacent to the fort, where that's where all the Rangers did their thing. And they were very, very, you know, you read some of the, not to get off topic, but you read some of the primary sources about the way the Rangers acted that was radically different from British regular soldiers. And there was a lot of complaints from the high command, the sort of normal conventional officers. For example, there was one officer, and I don't remember his name, forgive me, but he was complaining because the Rangers love to shoot their muskets. They love to train. And he thought it was just a giant waste of ammunition. So he went to Robert and he said, you can't do this anymore. Stop it. We're done. You can't practice marksmanship so long as you're in your bivouac. No more of this. Like, it's loud, it's obnoxious, you're done. And so Robert Rogers was like, roger that. And so what he would do is, prior to launching a mission, he would basically get, 100 meters outside of the fort, set up a range and say, okay, we're going to train now before we go on the SOP, go. And they would just blast all of their muskets and sort of training and giant like a middle finger to the British high command. And I think I read a quote from one of these individuals, one of the British officers, who would complain when the when the Rangers would go do this, and it was loud, it was obnoxious, they were clearly disobeying orders, and it just drove them absolutely mad. But going back to as sort of the war progressed, the individuals they brought on, when they actually went and launched the St. Francis raid, a huge bulk of their force, close to 50%, maybe a little less, were not actually Rangers. they were a variety of different individuals. Like you had the Jersey Blues, which was essentially a militia group, so to speak, of infantry guys from, again, like what we would term like a National Guard unit. And their officer was like, hey, we want in on this. We absolutely love you, Rangers. You know, can we please join you? We promise to be tactically proficient and follow whatever you say. And so there were a bunch of guys who actually technically were not Rangers going on the St. Francis raid, but Robert Rogers recognized like, hey, I could use these guys. They're well trained. They might not be Rangers, but you know what? They're tactically proficient enough, and I need the guys. So let's go ahead and let them join our company.
So historically, in the historical context here, it sounds like cracking of the voice. It sounds like Rogers he was in the right place at the right time with a certain amount of audacity, right? So
Absolutely.
for the ability to, we'll call it spontaneously become a captain, was just one chapter, one scene in the film, but the setting really did allow him to become such. Like the setting was vital here. And the reason why I'm bringing that up as a reference is I don't see much of an equivalent today. And I've been thinking, well, there's a lot of things that are the same. There's a lot of things that are very different. And one of them that's the same is special operations is a bunch of cowboys that doesn't listen to the rules. They don't care about your we just don't like this is it's an anecdotal story, but it's a small one. I remember being on my second deployment running into we didn't wear patches, right? So special operations guys typically don't wear patches on deployment. Maybe name, rank, and U.S. Army, but no like deployment patches, nothing like that. Nothing that would identify you as different. Right. So, but at the same time, let's be clear, the absence of something can sometimes be an identifier.
Yes. Right? Yeah, for sure.
So I remember like we're walking to the Chow Hall. We're on a massive base overseas. It's been there for a while. I think there was a Burger King on site, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But we were walking to the Chow Hall, which was like suffering a horrible logistics year. So we're gonna go get more boiled chicken because that's what everyone's eating.
Hard-boiled eggs and chicken.
It was not even. I don't even know if we had hard-boiled eggs. It was like frostbitten cucumbers and chicken breasts with different flavors every day. It was kind of rough for a while. That's a bit of an exaggeration too, anyway. But the point is we're going there. We've got our own equipment, which is different than everybody else's on the base. Our rifles are painted. We've got suppressors. There's just kind of like stacking a bunch of stuff. And, and we're going to the same chow hall where people have their 20-year-old, 20-inch barreled M16s. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't uncommon that we would get yelled at by somebody, yeah. some officer or some higher enlisted guy would yell, find one of our guys alone, maybe he's hitting the shop ed or the PX or whatever, and he's like, where, he'd yell at him, and because he knows he's got rank, and he would be like, where's your unit patch? And I remember thinking to myself, we've been in this war for 10 years and you haven't figured that out yet. If he doesn't have unit patches on, it's a good indicator. It's a pretty good indicator. Like, yeah, sure, he's young, but it's a pretty good indicator that guy is probably in one of those units that you're not in. So maybe stay in your lane and go yell at somebody else for their sideburns, because
right.
Like you're not going to make the cut. You don't have the observation skills necessary to identify where you're at in the world. So like, bro, and I'm not trying to say this as an elitist in that position, although that's certainly another relevant element that happens with the special operations community. It still is today, right? Like grooming standards, long hair, beards, tattoos, what is the bro vet look in 2015 is like longer hair, beard, your tattoos. Now we're starting to reach onto the backs of hands, and you get all this kind of stuff, right?
Right.
Whereas like the British military enlisted, or British military circa Robert Rogers era, had his idea not of soldiering, but like the profession. And so that is a long way of saying for you to say that to the normal British officer, marksmanship wasn't even on the checklist sounds kind of unusual I think would sound unusual to someone today.
Yeah.
What then was it that they prioritized? Why is that, like, marksmanship it has always been important to the American for some extent. It's just been there's a tie. I know people have tried to make kind of mythical ties between the gun is the sword of the American knight who's the cowboy,
Sure.
or whatever. But can you go into some detail on why the idea of Robert Rogers was so antithetical to your normal British officer during the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And there's a lot to unpack. Essentially, what was happening at this time was they were trying to, over the course of hundreds of years, warfare in Europe had been essentially standardized. There was a code of conduct. There was a way in which you were supposed to go out as a country, as a region. You know, there were kingdoms, and then there were states, there were state. All of these things were sort of crystallizing over the course of hundreds of years. And actually, I talk about this in depth in one of my episodes about the sort of standardization of modern warfare. And what and again, I'm going to try to encapsulate this as best I can in a very brief way. In Europe, they had basically figured out, hey guys, instead of devastating one another in these wars where we literally target civilian populations, which we've been doing for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, let's get away from that. And warfare, there were rules and regulations that they all sort of eventually agreed upon. Now, of course, many of them broke the rules. It always happens. But fundamentally, they were like, hey, okay, when we go to war, we're going to meet each other in pitch battle on an open field. We're going to have cavalry, artillery, infantry, and we're just going to meet each other kind of like a chessboard. You're going to have your commanders in the back, and then we're going to sort of lead our men into combat face to face. They're going to gun each other down, and then we'll sort of try to outflank one another with our cavalry, dragoons, if you will. And then over here on this hillside, we're going to bombard the other army with our cannons. And so it was very much this, like I said, it was like chess. Like obviously it was a little more complicated than that, but fundamentally what they were trying to do was go to war, and it was very politicized, meaning they saw warfare as sort of the last resort to decide border disputes, to when they couldn't come to any sort of conclusion face to face using words or documents, they were like, okay, we have no other choice. Let's go to war.
So this is actually an important philosophical distinction, because the idea of Western philosophy is different than Eastern philosophy in this subject. And you made a sentence that warfare was effectively the last option of a series of political options.
Yeah, right.
It's like what did you say? You said it was the last it was essentially a tool of diplomacy.
Exactly.
But it was the last tool of diplomacy. So
Right.
you had all these things that you would do, and if all else failed, you go to war.
Correct.
So that I think is a very, like, I want to put a pin in that. Are we able to do that? Because
yeah. And then I can answer your question about how Robert was and the Rangers were so fundamentally different, and why marksmanship in particular is a great sort of anecdote of what distinguished a Ranger from a regular. So you had that standardization, that code of conduct, the articles of war that took place in Europe that had crystallized. And then all of a sudden now you had these European powers that were expanding beyond their borders into areas that were uncharted, they were running into groups that did not know about the rules of war, didn't understand the rules of war, didn't care about the rules of war. And so all of a sudden, they were dealing with a whole new tactical situation. And so the British regulars that you had in North America, that was actually totally dissimilar from the French. The French figured this out much, much sooner, so to speak. And so you had these British regulars where they didn't need you to be really good at hitting a target at 100 meters. That was the size of a dollar. They needed you to stand in line, listen to orders, fire your musket and or rifle, depending on what year we're talking about, into the enemy line. And when you heard some sort of signal, whether it was a horn or a flag or whatever, you were going to advance, or you were going to pivot your force and maybe come across the field of battle. And so the notion that you would use concealment, or you would use cover, or you would wear green jackets so that you would blend into your environment, right? You were being what we would refer today as tactically proficient. That was anathema to their way of war. It was like, no, we're going to go meet this guy at this open field over here, and he's going to have his army, and I'm going to have my army, and we're just going to meet each other face to face, and then we're going to try to outmaneuver one another. And so when it came down to the individual soldier, I wouldn't say all they needed them to do, but fundamentally all they really needed them to do was, hey, don't think, I know you're scared shitless, but I need you to stand there and wait for my order. And then when you're given the order, you fire your rifle. Whereas for the Rangers, they were like, hey, we need to go hide in the wood line and tactically move through this wilderness without anybody noticing us, so we can get eyes on the objective and pull a reconnaissance for 24 hours and then count out, okay, they've got, I see 6 French officers. Okay, write that down. Okay, I see they've got, their cannons are facing this way. Okay, go, roger that, got that. And then you got guys behind them in the wood line pulling security just in case there's an enemy patrol coming around. And so the need of a ranger, what they required in order to just survive, was radically different than your average British foot soldier. And you see this come to sort of a head when multiple times during the French and Indian War, the British would lead or attempt to lead some sort of siege against a French fort, and they would still bring the Rangers with them as a reconnaissance force, as exterior security. So you'd have the main bulk of the British force moving through the wood line, maybe on a road, maybe not. And they would deploy the Rangers to their flanks and being like, hey, prevent anybody from ambushing it. If you see a French force, a patrol, a scouting party, either destroy them or scare them off. And then they would get in these huge battles, and the British soldiers would just get absolutely annihilated, because all they were trained to do and all they really knew was, hey, you're going to stand there and take it and fire back at the enemy. Whereas the Rangers, and it seems like common sense, but the Rangers were like, when all this was happening, when they actually hit the fort, or they were close to the fort and they actually met a resistance force, they would immediately take cover. They would get behind a rock. They would get in a ditch, and they would start actually like using their marksmanship and actually start picking off French Native Americans, French officers. And there's a note, and then I mentioned this in one of the episodes, where even we have writings from the French during a particular battle where they basically said, like, the British soldiers or whatever, but those Rangers were literally just shooting us in the face. Like, we couldn't stop them. Their marksmanship was excellent. They could hit, they could hit anything they aimed at, and they're absolutely terrifying. And it's a reminder that, what it took to be a Ranger in terms of skill set versus what it took to be a British soldier, they were just a difference in kind, right? They're both soldiers, but, I don't know that you could take a Ranger and pick him up and put him in the same situation as a British regular and say, hey, you're going to walk out, guys are going to start shooting at you. You're just going to keep marching, and with your your rifle in a certain position. And it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter if the guy next to you gets hit in the face. There's no cover. There's no concealment. Just keep walking. And when you hear your order, you're going to level your rifle. And the training they had was you would basically level your rifle and aim it slightly up. You weren't aiming at anything in particular. It was just, you're given the order, level your rifle, ready, set, fire. You would fire, you start reloading, and they had a system in place for that kind of thing. But I don't know that you could actually take a Ranger, put him in that situation, and he would have the training or the capability or mindset to just eat it, essentially. So that was the clear sort of difference between the two, and why British regulars very often could not do the ranging job because it was completely anathema to what they were trained to do.
So I do recall reading about this a number of times, and you're putting it at, you're telling me that it wasn't just a level of skill. It wasn't just a level of, well, you know, the marks, I'm going to use contemporary terms for this,
Please,
but like,
yeah.
It wasn't that the difference between a ranger and a non-ranger was a PT score of like,
Right.
are you above a 70%? You know, are you above at least a
Yeah.
270 or whatever, right?
Right.
It was a difference. When you say a difference in kind, I think I found it most interesting that you said you could not take one of Roger's Rangers and make him into a regular. They were anathema in construction. So with that being the case, what I was going back to, I want to go back to that part where I said, well, let's put a pin in it, is that the British or the Western tradition had seen warfare as an extent of diplomacy, the final act in diplomacy. Now, I think isn't that also reflected in von Clausewitz? I can't remember.
It is. Yeah, yeah.
It
No,
is.
100%. Yes. 1000%. Yeah, he talks about this a lot.
But von Clausewitz comes later. He comes after the French Revolution. So
yeah,
he does come, but but we're also seeing this develop at the same time, because what I've seen in history and where my observation of like history of special operations going from, say, or not even special operations, but history of this type of warfare is that you had Roger's period of time, and then that was followed by the American Revolution, which led to large political revolutions.
Napoleon, yeah.
Which then moved on to Napoleon, which then saw a re-standardization, because that's what Napoleon did. Napoleon, and then as a consequence of Napoleon, von Clausewitz set a paradigm for warfare, which became what you and I refer to as conventional warfare.
Yeah.
Which then I'd make the argument that that paradigm of warfare concluded with World War II. World War II was the end of conventional warfare as a paradigm. And conventional warfare still does see, this is like a problem that where I'm seeing people like not being able to grasp it, or being able to grasp it quite well, is that warfare today is not armies. It is not uniforms. Warfare today is, if you're not special forces, you're not in it. You just aren't. You're not special forces. You know what I mean? Like if you're not in
special operations,
if you're not in some part of the special operations world, you're kind of. This is not true, by the way. I'm not trying to make this as a definitive pinpoint, because there's Marines in Ramadi. There's blah 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 blah. Like I'm not trying to go down that road, but it's that now we no longer operate in that metaphor where warfare is the final straw in a diplomatic cycle or a strain of diplomacy. It's now much earlier.
Right.
We engage in unconventional warfare in theory. The world engages in certainly the world does. I'm not going to say I'm speaking in terms of national policy for the United States, but I am saying that it doesn't work that way anymore. It's not that we start, that you and I, that two countries, that America and Russia negotiate about a trade deal, and then when that trade deal goes down, then we start spooling up armies, deploying forces. It's like, yeah, hey, I'm going to sit at the counter. Meanwhile, my spies are my intelligence agencies are spying on your intelligence agencies. My armies are I'm already, and I'm fomenting a proxy war over here on your border, and we are. I don't know. You see how I'm saying that? Is that
No, it does. It's really interesting too, and this is one of the things I bring up a variety of times in a few episodes, which is Max Boot. He's a historian. He does some other things. He's now very politically engaged, I believe. But he wrote a book called Invisible Armies, and his general thesis was what we consider today to be asymmetrical warfare is actually the normal state of warfare if you were to look at all human history, including prehistory.
Yep.
And sometime in, like we were sort of discussing, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, and then really begins to crystallize in the 18th and 19th century, Western European powers come up with the Articles of War. Hey, let's, if we have to go to war, so be it, but let's just like sort of get it over with, right? Let's just meet on an open field and crush each other. And whoever wins, wins. And now as you said, we sort of devolved or began to devolve back to the state of the natural state of warfare as it had already existed previously to this epoch, this era. And so really what's going on now is nothing, and this is one of the things that he talks about in his book, but like asymmetric warfare is nothing new. Ambushing, raids, surprising your enemy, catching them off guard, you know, using whatever leverage you have to defeat your enemy, that has been the natural state of warfare throughout most of human history. And what's super unique about, I would say, the West and the way the West has fought wars is that, in fact, we actually make rules. Like we actually
Yes.
say, hey, we're gonna, and Victor Davis Hanson attempts, and I think he's largely effective, although there is some criticism that is totally fair. He tries to suggest that in ancient Greece, it was actually the ancient Greeks who came up with this standardization of warfare in the way that Clausewitz conceptualized it, which is two Greek city-states are at a point where diplomacy is not working. It's June, right? Because our armies are made up of farmers. So we're going to go meet in this place with our hoplites, and we're going to face each other head on, and we're going to engage in combat. And whoever wins, wins. And that's the end of it. And then you get whatever you want, and then we all go home. Now, that's an oversimplification. And
Yes.
this is the criticism of Hansen that I have and that a lot of scholars have, which is that, again, most of Greek warfare was not so simple. But that paradigm, that concept of two professional, pseudo-professional armies, because a lot of people would argue that ancient hoplite armies weren't actually professional, with a few exceptions. Sparta was one of them, obviously, but most Greek armies were made up of agrarian farmers.
Yep. And so, and I kind of want to, if I understand, I'm clarifying that what you mean by professional soldiers is that was not just their responsibility to defend their territory, but it was their job. Like
Correct.
you and I, we live in a world of a paradigm of jobs, and especially in the West, our identity is closely tied to it. Maybe there's some criticism to be there. In fact, there probably is, but not to be too foreshadowing. The idea during the hoplite era was that it was very rare to have someone whose sole occupation was to fight.
Correct.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I imagine that the Industrial Revolution had an impact on the idea of professional soldiering, especially
100%.
because now you could produce at scale enough resources where someone could quite literally spend all of his time training.
Well, not only that, but being a soldier, a professional soldier, you know, after the Roman period. So moving beyond that into sort of the medieval period, early medieval period, and then sort of the middle and later medieval period. If you were a professional soldier, what you really were you were an aristocrat, you had land holdings, you had titles, and so you had a revenue of income from your tenants, so to speak. And again, I'm doing lots of generalizations, and there's a bunch of differences. Spain in the medieval period looked very different than Europe, but again, broad strokes here.
Because the question that I'm kind of trying to get to is, and it's one that I don't know, I have almost no grounding. Oh no, that's not completely true. Is why was it that the Rangers were so different than the British regulars? And my point on it is this: is not. And my point on it is there something happened in order. Many things happened in order for the British to come to the conclusion that marksmanship was not important, but soldiering meant following following orders, basically, right?
Yeah.
So instead, like, and at the time of Rogers, history illustrates how the British structure, their paradigm of war, was ineffective, and how they were reliant on the ragtag band of heroes, as a joke, to essentially do the fighting. Now, how did they get there? Because, you know, we're talking about, we're going to go back to like the cavalry charge. The machine gun killed the cavalry charge, Before the machine gun was there, the cavalry charge was a devastating move.
Right.
So how did the British get to the point where their regulars
Couldn't
were,
do the job.
well, maybe not even couldn't do the job. That's probably that's one phrase, but like, because how did we get there? How did the British get there? What were the conventions of warfare that developed that as their strategy? Because I'm going to assume that British command was not so anemic to common sense to argue that the only thing a British regular needs to do is listen to a drum and right face, left face, raise musket, shoot. Like there was something that came out of that, and it wasn't, that came from somewhere. It wasn't born in a void.
So 2 things.
Mm-hmm.
Number 1, terrain. So fighting in North America was more akin, when we think of New England, we don't think of dense forests that you can barely, maneuver through, so to speak. But at the time, and still to this day in a lot of places, the landscape was more akin to the jungles of Vietnam than it was to what we were sort of aware of. If you live in Connecticut or New York, you can kind of buzz around in cars. Yeah, there's woods everywhere, but if you go for a hike, you sort of bebop around on a trail. The landscape was devastating. I mean, moving armies was so difficult that early on during the war, one of the first jobs the Rangers had was actually cutting roads.
Mm-hmm.
And if it wasn't them cutting roads, they would be the protective detail that would go into territory that was typically occupied by Native Americans, or at least it was territory that was in conflict, so to speak. But the British High Command was like, hey, we need a road. We've got all this men, we've got materiel, we got wagons, we got all this equipment and resources. We need to get from point A to point B. The only way we can do it is if we cut a road through this maze of wilderness. And so we literally have to take woodcutters, private contractors. They're going to cut the road. Well, they're getting ambushed. Okay, who can we use as a protective detail to defend these individuals? Well, let's, Joe Blow down the street. He's a hunter. He's a great marksman. Let's get him and a couple other guys to sort of be a cordon for our woodcutters. And so that was actually one of the original jobs Rogers had. He was in a militia prior to the outbreak of war. And one of the jobs and roles and responsibilities he had was to actually go out and defend these woodcutters as they literally cut through this effectively like a jungle in the wilderness. So the landscape required or demanded that you could no longer move, 500 men and cannon and horses through this landscape to face your enemy head on. So that was one major factor. The second major factor was that the French were utilized, unlike the British, the French had colonized Canada much differently. So instead of just sort of allowing a bunch of people to come in, they set up their families, they set up towns, they eventually set up cities, and there's a harbor and this and that and yada, yada, yada. They, by and large, would send individuals, typically military men, into these regions to do whatever it was they were doing, whatever job they needed to facilitate. That was what they were there to do. And so, like I said earlier, their armies, the men, their paramilitary force was predominantly Native Americans. And guess what? Native Americans don't play by the rules of war. They have their own ways of fighting war. They're super effective. They've been using them at that point for thousands of years. And instead of the French trying to take on the incredibly difficult task of taking a Native American and being like, hey, here's your uniform, here's your musket, here's how we do warfare. You're going to stand in line and fire at each other. They were like, hey, these Native Americans are really good at fighting each other. Let's just let them do their thing. And so when they faced the British were trying to use the tactics that they had always used. And so while they were, again, trying to just line each other up and shoot at each other, going on, whatever, moving from point A to point B. The Native Americans just completely ignored that. And likewise with the French, they were like, you know what? To hell with the way of war in Europe. We're just going to follow suit with the way the Native Americans have been doing this forever. And so by the way, this goes into, I think, something that you were referencing. This is not so dissimilar from what we're facing today.
Yeah, this is where I'm working my way there because yep, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, when you're dealing with an insurgent force that is conducting an insurgency, so Al Qaeda, the Viet Cong, the Taliban, right? Like, they're not going to go by the same rules that we're going to go by. And so we have to essentially, and I'm going to talk about this actually in my next episode, counterinsurgency and insurgency, or unconventional warfare, UW, they're opposite sides of the same coin. And they look very similar to each other, but they're complete opposites. And in order to effectively defeat an insurgency, you're going to have to fight very, very similar to the way the insurgency is fighting. And that's basically what the British learned the hard way over the course of the French and Indian War. Was in the beginning, they were thinking, let's just keep doing what we've always done. And by the end of the war, they were like, hey, this, they didn't regard it as counterinsurgency, but basically they figured out, like, Robert and his Rangers are way better at this than we could ever be. Let's just keep deploying him to fight the French and their native allies. If we need to go raid a Native American village, like they've been raiding our frontier for the last 100+ years, then let's go do that, because that seems to be effective.
Yeah, this raises an ethical problem for me, not just for myself. I think this raises an ethical problem that perhaps is at the core of insurgency, especially in this case. And then maybe not even insurgency, but it's that it comes down to ethics and utilitarianism. And that is, one can make the argument that having an ethical system is has the functional utility of bolstering its fighting capacity. I know people like to use terms like force multiplier or whatever to muddy the stream, but the one of the consistencies that sounds like, when you hear it, when I say it, I go, well, of course, and everyone's going to say, of course, but it's that the fighting force that believes that what they're doing is right will have an advantage over a fighting force that believes that what they're doing is for individual profit or some advancement, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so, like,
absolutely,
you can have, and so what I'm talking about here and why I'm getting to that point is that the ethical framework that the world, and I believe that a lot of that this is dealing with, has a certain problem, which is rules for thee, but not for me, because I'm willing to foment rebellion and target your women and children. Famously, like, we've heard stories from Vietnam where women would strap bombs to babies and hand them to soldiers. We've seen it in Afghanistan where the Taliban is not going to go fight the Army Rangers. They're going to use a bomb in a house.
IEDs,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
IEDs. They're going to target. They're indifferent. Like, and there's actually, I think, one of the more disturbing versions of it is, I recently read this document by Crime Think, which is talks about the siege of Minneapolis, the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis, and I put it into an episode, so people who are staying up to the show will kind of recognize where I'm going here, because we're talking about TTPs, and there's this ethical framework that the author is existing in, that as you read through his article, you see what he believes, he or she believes, or they or them, whatever it is, and it's published anonymously. But the point is that he views the people, the quote unquote peaceful protesters, as people that produce the spectacle of legitimacy, something that they can hide within. But he knows that the quote unquote peaceful protesters might get arrested because of his actions,
right?
And that them getting arrested is another opportunity for him to foment rebellion within their attitudes. right? And so what you're seeing,
Absolutely, yeah.
so what you could see it in this way is like we're going to go back to the Afghanistan example. The people that we were fighting in Afghanistan didn't really care about the well-being and the follow-through of the well-being and the let's see, the quality of life or the ethics violations done against their own people, against the Taliban. Sorry, not the Taliban, against the Afghani population. So this created almost like a three-party problem where you had the American military who was bound by a set of rules that involved treating people as combatants and non-combatants. The opponents did not believe in that. It was targets of opportunity. And then you had the population, which this is where the term hearts and minds was being used, that Americans were supposedly trying to win over the hearts and minds of the Afghani people so that they wouldn't turn to, like, say, China or become communist, and maybe that's a long form, or that they wouldn't turn to the Taliban. In fact, we wanted the Afghani people to reject the Taliban and to support America. The Taliban didn't care. They just killed them.
Yeah.
Repeatedly. Right. And so I know this is a bit of a long way of getting to it, but what I'm seeing in this example, and I'm wondering if that same moral dilemma was present if you have any historical evidence to say that the same moral dilemma was relevant in the time of Rogers, because I think it's time that we move on in history, is that your ethical framework that you wage your war in not only might have the utility of bolstering their moral composure, but it also, like, I think there's much more serious consequences to fighting an unjust war than, say, and being politically unpopular. I'm just going to go there, and I'm going to make that as an assumption. I think, in some ways, the PTSD that individuals encounter has to do with moral injury from war, where they don't necessarily believe in what they're doing, but they go along with it. Or they believe that they're doing something wrong, but they're not willing to, refuse, step out of it. Or they witness some tragedy that otherwise challenges their previous worldview. And so the issue that we're dealing with here is that the way that you're describing it is we can have our morally justified framework for our rules of engagement, but those don't matter when we're fighting against an enemy that doesn't follow those, which ultimately says that morals don't matter at all, which itself is a form of nihilism that I think arguably is defeat. I'm putting on the 4D chess hat and saying I can defeat my enemy by demoralizing them, by convincing them that their own moral framework is inefficient before even raising a shot, which sounds a lot like Sun Tzu, which is relevant in our contemporary era where our generals and our rules of engagement writers are so defeated, or worse, they don't believe that we are a morally justified army, that we lose the battle because we're stuck in this issue. And that's a huge leap. I know we're stuck in this issue where, the war that is being waged against us is being waged against us on a level that we're not even comprehending.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the biggest dilemmas that the United States faces when it comes to waging wars is that it seems to me, as we progress from, into the future, and I don't know, I kind of know where it comes from. I think part of it is the fact that we're so isolated from the rest of the world and so protected.
Sure.
But as I look at what the United States military was willing to do through every conflict it's fought in, as we move forward in the future, and there's huge positives to this, by the way, each individual that is a part of that war, so each soldier, each sailor, Marine, whatever, we value their life. And I think part of it has to do with the philosophy of being an American. I think it has to do with being a democratic republic. I think there's a lot of reasons why this is, but we value the individual life more so than any other civilization that has possibly ever existed in human history. And so when we
can you illustrate that in a way that doesn't sound like cops and robbers? Because it like that's not an insignificant statement.
So a good example, let me see. So okay, so a good example of this, sort of where we started and where we've come, kind of what we were talking about earlier. So when you had Robert Rogers during the battle on snowshoes, where you had a company-sized element go out, I want to say there was roughly like 100 plus Rangers on this operation. It was in the middle of winter. They were largely unsuccessful. And as they were coming back to base, RTB, they caught sight of an enemy patrol. They set up an ambush. The enemy came through their ambush site. They hit them. They wreaked havoc on them. It turns out that was the front end of a scouting party, or it was a scouting party, and that the larger force was basically right behind them, and the Rangers had no idea. And so they hit these guys, they ambushed them, and then almost immediately that larger force just got sucked in and completely surrounded the Rangers. And it was like a 4-hour battle. It was absolutely devastating. And I want to say 56% of the Rangers that were caught in that skirmish died. And the rest of them basically fled. They were completely scattered across the wilderness. Some made it back, some didn't, some were captured. And if that was translated to today, where you had let's take Ranger Battalion. If you had a Ranger officer, a captain, who led a company-sized element out, and he lost 56% of his force, he would more than likely, whether it was his fault or not, be relieved of duty or put in another position. That would be an absolute catastrophe. There would be books written about it. We would talk about it in the news endlessly. There would be conversations of, we need to completely rethink the way we're fighting this war. There was 100 Americans in this one battle, and 56 of them died. Like, what are we doing? Mm-hmm. And at that time, the British High Command and the Rangers were like, yeah, that's business as usual. Like, people die. Yeah, we lost 56% or 56% of our force. So what? Let's get some more Rangers. Let's go do it again. Yeah. And that happened over and over and over again. And as you progress through into the Common Era, into the 20th century, and I'm sort of going through this right now in my research, what the United States military and the CIA and DC writ large was willing to do in the Vietnam War is, there's no way we would do it today. And so, for example, the MACV-SOG mission.
Yep, I recently read about this.
Is one of the most incredible operations that the Army and Special Forces has ever undertaken. I mean, what those guys were doing, what they did. I mean, you have stories of 6-man hatchet teams doing a recon mission who are getting overrun by a battalion-sized element of VC. They're shooting in every direction. They're black on ammo. They're getting ammo dropped in on them. They're reloading. They're calling in airstrikes. They're like killing thousands of men. And I forget I wish I could remember, but it was something like 92% of MACV-SOG guys were casualties of war.
Yep.
If you were to take that template and then put it over the Iraq-Afghanistan war, that would be akin to going to ODAs, or let's be real, JSOC, CAG, Ranger Battalion, and being like, hey, we're going to do a secret war. We're going to deploy you guys in small recon teams into Pakistan over the border. And all these supply lines, because the Taliban was getting resupplied, it was a huge problem. They would just go to Pakistan, come back, go back and forth, back and forth. We're going to have you guys go there, and you're just going to ambush these supply lines. You're going to kill as many bad guys as you can. Yeah, it's illegal that you're in Pakistan, but you know what? It's what's necessary. That may have happened during the war, but to this day, if it did, it's still classified. And by the way, it was like a very, very small sliver of, if I was to guess, probably like what the CIA was doing. But again, like, was it this DOD type operation? Absolutely not. Were there FOBs with Green Berets who were going out in Hueys, and actually they weren't using Hueys, they were using other aircraft that I can't remember. The CB, what are the C something? I can't remember. It's on the tip of my tongue. But anyways, my point is, going back to what we're talking about, the United States willingness for the loss of life.
Yes.
Like the fact that, and this is sort of the cap I'll end with. You know, tragically, we lost 13 Marines at Abbey Gate during the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's worth talking about. It's worth remembering. You know, no matter if you were a member of those families, if you're a Marine on the ground there, like, it is wonderful that we value human life so much that, you know, 13 Marines died as we were withdrawing. If that was any other moment in history, it wouldn't even be a footnote. It wouldn't even make it into the book about the conflict.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I can see where you're going with that, because you look at, like
look at Gettysburg. In Gettysburg, there were 9,000 human KIA.
yes.
That is almost double what we lost. Well, a little less than double, but a hell of a lot more in one battle in the Civil War than we lost in 20 years in both Iraq and Afghanistan.
Very
and
much
most Americans, you know, it's like, oh, Gettysburg, I have to study in middle school. Like, who cares? And it's like, holy shit, 9,000 guys died in one single battle. And it's like, we don't even talk about it, really.
Yeah, the scale of warfare. I mean, it's like, you look at the casualties on Omaha Beach. You look at the casualties in, you know, there's like, I'm kind of putting this together now as you're saying it. There's sort of a point in history, because I remember as a private, 19 years old, Ranger Battalion, I had to memorize all of the.
Yeah. Yes,
I think I had to have all of the BCO Bravo Company KIA names memorized, all of them.
Yeah.
And I remember
it's a cultural thing.
Well, I'm not saying this to diminish that event, but
no, not at all. Yeah.
It was like it took you like 2 days to memorize it. It was like, you know, it wasn't more than 30 names. And so there was an importance to that. And I'm not saying that I'm not making a moral evaluation of it, but like, you're not memorizing 9,000 names. You know, you're not memorizing that. You're not, and okay, so that's a major departure. And I think that, you know, that's definitely a post-Vietnam development, mostly. Mostly it's a post-Vietnam development. Okay. So
I would say it started in World War II, because even today we still remember a lot of the names, you know, Iwo Jima, you know, the 101st Airborne, like we still sort of fantasize isn't the right word, but to this day, we still talk about individuals that died in these battles, in these conflicts, especially when they did things that were heroic. Mm-hmm. But it's still part of our culture, our society. We make holidays after it, and I think there's good reasons for it. I think it's great. I think we should continue to do it. But with that said, moreover, there is a factor that needs to be addressed, which is what are we willing to sacrifice versus what are our enemies willing to sacrifice?
Okay.
And so this, I think, goes to the moral question that you're bringing up a little bit, in part, which is, to your point, like, there are certain paramilitary forces, there are certain groups, governments, like Russia is a great example of this. The Russian tactic is the polar opposite of that of the United States. And the tactic they're using today and have used is really not so dissimilar from the tactic they were using when they fought the Nazis, which is your individual life is fundamentally meaningless, because at the end of the day, it's about, at the time it was the party, now it's country, but you are supporting an idea. And so if
the Soviet, it's a crusade. It's a crusade with a dictator instead of a cross. I mean,
so we have to send
not even a dictator. It's a crusade with a hammer and sickle instead of a cross.
Right. So if we have to send tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of guys into combat, and maybe only a fraction of you actually have functioning weapons, that's just what it takes to protect the community, right? And so that is a fundamental difference of ideologies that exists even between nation states. Forget about the Viet Cong and the Taliban and Al Qaeda and extremist Islamist groups. You have state actors, and we as Americans are totally divorced from this. We have this vision of the world that everybody must think like us. Everyone wants the same freedoms and liberties that we do.
Yeah.
And we just, the way we respect individuals within the United States is fundamentally different than the way the rest of the world today respects individual lives. And that's certainly been the case true throughout all of human history.
Yeah. Well, I think some of that is being demonstrated today, where you have people arguing in favor of an individual's, or arguing that it is an individual's right to freedom of speech, when people like you have these like campus protests against the war, and the not the war, but like the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Right.
And somebody is supporting, voicing support for what an organization we deem to be a terror organization, Hamas, and then they get deported, and our own people are saying you're violating that person's right to the freedom of speech. And that's a very like that is so antithetical to, well, what we see basically everywhere else in the world, which is
right.
Like, oh, you want to voice support for our enemies? You're not welcome here.
Right.
In fact,
You're
we might even cause harm to you. So
yeah.
But I don't want to go further down that road because I don't know where we're going to get to it. So let's kind of zero back in on Rogers, because he, there are certain one thing that I experienced, and I'm not alone in this one, and something that I'm appreciating seeing in quite a bit of, let's call it, and for those who are listening, I don't mean this in the derogatory sense, but like the military veteran influencer corner, Sean Ryan, Sean Ryan's a good example. But there's this growing understanding, is not even the right way of saying it.
Awareness.
Even that sounds too simple. It's where the status quo has been: you go into special operations, you develop a drinking habit, you have 3 marriages, you're estranged from your family, but you have a cool guy life. You go do the job. You go, you know what I mean? There's this like chasing adventure fantasy,
chasing the dragon.
And I'm trying to diagnose this, and some of it is actually self-diagnosis. So there's some, let's call it latent narcissism involved, for a lack of humble words. But it's that there was that movie, The Hurt Locker, I think was it, where you had the one guy who's like the EOD guy, and at the end of the movie, he goes out on another deployment.
Yep. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And how one of the challenges that veterans experience when they get out of the war is they come back to the United States, and it seems not a lot has flavor. So, and you're gonna have, and I get it, you're gonna have your not warmongers isn't the right word, but you're gonna have your people who like me, create a podcast, try to talk about something. They want to tell stories about how cool they were. You're going to have people commit stolen valor. You're going to have this happen. Like, I don't know how to put it any other way other than having somebody lie about their experience is not as unusual as I want it to be. But at the same time, there's a certain range of acceptability for, let's say, exaggeration, personal experience, opinions, whatever. It's probably not a good idea to just write overt falsehoods about what you've done. But
are you trying to reference a book that just came out?
No, there's multiple people. It's like I'm wish. Okay, I'm just gonna go. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna go into it. The idea of like stolen valor is so mind-boggling because in our world, like it's so small. So if you come out and say, I was a ranger, somebody's gonna go look at a roster and say, nope. And now, what did you gain? Somebody thought you were cool for a few minutes on a podcast, but you're also now persona non grata, basically. You're no longer, you will never be accepted by the people whose acceptance you want. If you go and have a distinguished military career, but you lie about it, you're going to burn the, you're going to lose the thing that you're trying to claim in a form of justice. You are going to be denied ever having the opportunity of the honor that you might have deserved had you done something. But at the same time, so it's such a small thing. Like lying about your military service is strange because there's very, very little benefit.
Gain, yeah.
There's very little gain and everything to lose.
Right. So why did they do it? Is the question.
Because there's maybe this appeals to something that we're talking about on the earlier episode that we did, is that there's a need to be validated that wasn't accomplished in the military. Or
I think you could be right. I also think there may be a simpler answer, which is a lot of these guys, and again, I'm not going to point any fingers, but through some of the stuff I've read and some of the things that I understand about the business, a lot of these veterans come out, and this sort of ties into what happens to special operations guys post-military experience, post-enlistment, whatever. A lot of these guys have either an incredible story to tell of it in itself, or they've gained enough popularity that they've become not just influencers, but celebrities.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, when you get out as a guy from special operations, you go from, and again,
you go from a framework. You have a framework in which you have a world that you exist within, and now you're thrust into one where that is not. It doesn't have parity.
Well, you go from, frankly, I don't mean to like blow it out of proportion here, but you go from celebrity status in the military to being a nobody. And I'll give you a great example of what I'm talking about. So I remember I was 24 when I was getting out, and I was fresh. Like I was just about to hit my 6th year. I was an E6. I mean, in less than 6 years, I had become a Green Beret. I was dive qualified. I had combat experience. I had all these things going for me, and I was getting out, and I remember being at headquarters, and I was getting my shit stamped and signatures like, okay, you've exited, you're cleared from this office, whatever, go to the next one. And I remember handing my paperwork over to this young woman, the civilian who worked there. And she looked at me, or she looked at my paperwork and she looked at me, and she sort of repeated what I just said. She was like, you're an E6, you've got a long tab, you've got combat, like you're totally postured to have arguably one of the most successful military careers anyone could dream of.
Yeah, you're in the 1% at this point in time of the military, right? Of the combat arms professions.
Exactly. And you're leaving? Like what are you? And she said to me, she was like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And I was sort of flabbergasted. I was like, I don't know. Like I'm gonna go do other things. But there's this thing they say to you when you're in the Q course. And I don't know if it's intentional or if it's just in passing, but I distinctly remember guys saying, when you get your long tab, much by the way, like when you're in Ranger Battalion and you've got your Ranger tab and your scroll, when you're walking across a post and like people see you, not to sound like a total douchebag, but like you do it, like people do a double take. They're like, oh shit, there's one of those guys.
Yes, I completely agree. I get what you're saying. And it's sort of this, like, I may, I want to say it in I want to say it in a way that it is not beneficial, is like there is, I think it's an unwritten expectation, to be clear. Like there is, but that you want to be, there is a certain drive, and I think I'm even putting in this together, building this plane mid-flight, to quote Nathan Spearing. But you have to, in order to go through these kind of selection processes, we sort of expect that you have to have a certain amount of self initiative. You need to have drive. You need to have, you need to be your own generator of motivation for some extent.
Right.
And what I
Right,
mean
right,
by
right.
that is, like, there are a number of things that distinguish people in this environment, and one of them is, do you see problems as excuses, or do you see excuses not to do your job, or do you see problems as things to be solved?
Yeah, we talked about this.
We
Yeah.
talked about this in the past. So, and what I mean by that is that, like, that motivation to be the guy that gets the attention because he has, like, you want to have your reward for doing the thing. Does that make sense? Now,
Yeah.
I'm making this sound really vague. And I think one of the reasons why it oftentimes goes unstated is because it's a very uncomfortable thing. And I think in a certain sense, it's kind of dirty, which is, I don't want to tell anyone that my motivation for joining the Rangers is so that people would think I'm cool, right?
But of course, it's part of it,
But
right?
it's
Like
part of it. There is
you want to be accepted. You want to be in the group. You want to be the cool guy. You want to be the one that has the special weapons, and it's all, and that's why we continue to wear the Vans and the Converse and the. I still wear the Silkies when I go run, and like there is certainly a part of me. This is going to sound so ridiculous, but like every once in a while, somebody recognizes, like, oh, that guy's wearing shorty short Silkies that are black.
Mm-hmm.
Probably from special operations, because only dudes from that community wear that shit.
Yep. Yep. Or I mean, we have like I went to an event the other day, and of everybody there, everybody was wearing a black t-shirt with a white logo over the left breast, right? With a large decal on the back. When I'm saying everybody, I'm saying every single man who was there.
Yeah.
It was like, you would have
signals that
exactly
you're in the group. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. But it's like, and I don't want to go, we can't get too far into it, but it's like, well, we can go as far as we want. This is my damn show. I do what I want with it. It's like there's this criticism that you're like, oh, you're just trying to signal that you're in the group. True, but
everyone does that.
But there are people in the group. There is like, you say, oh, I want to have a gun community, and then you criticize anybody who goes and starts to build their own little subculture. You're kind of your own problem, man. That's what it is. So
and one thing I would note too is, like, these habits, these patterns exist in all facets of human, in communities. And so a great example of this is, like, if you go work on Wall Street, guess what? There is a uniform that the guys on Wall Street, the brokers, that they wear. There are specific suits they wear. There are specific watches they wear.
Yep.
And they do that in order to signal to their group and to outsiders that, hey, I made it. I'm in this group. I'm a member. You should respect me. And this was true, by the way. So I was in the LAPD. There's another weird side quest of my life. I was in the LAPD, and well, I don't know if I'd say I was in the academy, and then I was literally about to graduate, and I got a job offer, and I ended up dropping my.
Yep. There was a change in plans,
change of plans. I went to do other things for other organizations, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought this was so fascinating. I remember being on the range with the firearms instructors, and they're a unique breed versus the guys that are teaching in the classroom, right? They're just different in kind, right? They're both police officers, but these guys are the guys in the streets that are like spear tackling gangbangers, whatever. And now they have to do their time in the academy. And at some point I noticed that all of the firearms instructors of the LAPD used Glocks, which is a choice that you can, you have in the LAPD, they have a whole host of different firearms you can use. And they all had Glock 17s, and they all wore Rolex watches. And these are cops that are not making that much money, and they're living in LA, which is super expensive, right? These are like $8,000 watches.
Mm.
And I remember asking one of the guys, I was like, what's the deal? Like, why do you all wear Rolex watches? And he basically, if I can remember correctly, gave me some explanation of basically once you've done X, Y, and Z as a beat cop, or you've proven yourself to the LAPD, you're at a certain point in your career, whatever, you've done something. There's this moment where, okay, you go buy a Rolex watch to signal to the group that you are a member of that group. And so we do this in the special operations community 100 million times that of everybody else. Like there are all kinds of things we do. I mean, I haven't been in the military for almost 6 years. There is still stuff that I wear, clothing, shoes, watches, even the way I carry, like there are all kinds of stuff that I do.
Yes.
Whether it's habit or just like me intuitively or subconsciously hoping that like, so like, I don't, by the way, side note, just as like to clarify, despite the stuff that's behind me, I don't think I own a single piece of clothing with a special forces insignia on it. I don't have a hat. Like there's nothing that directly specifies that I was in this community or part of this unit. And a lot of guys do that. I just don't, I don't want to do whatever. With that being said, I still do things like the Ranger panties that I wear. I mean, there's all kinds of things that I do that if you are from that community, you intuitively know like, oh, that guy's it. He's from the group.
Well, and sometimes people outside recognize that too. Cause like, I remember, this is my story from college. I was in a systematic theology class of all places. And it is what it is. It's one of my degrees is in theology, but that's kind of beyond the point. One of the other students identified that I was a veteran because I wore my watch on the inside of my wrist.
Yeah, right.
You know
That's
what I mean?
a great example. Yeah.
And he was like, "Oh yeah, you definitely have to be military." And I was like, and I'm thinking like, obviously, I'm a 6 foot tall white dude with tattoos. Like, okay, you know. Shocker.
Yeah.
But he's like, oh no, it was your watch. Like other people have tattoos, it was your watch. And I was like, huh, interesting. So that note, and I think there's a little bit of like that Jason Bourne mixed into it too, of like, ooh, I can read all the signs. And I do think some people take it a little too far, but we can be entertained by it.
I have a funny story, and then I promise you we can drive on. And
go ahead.
It's one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. I was at school. I was working out in the university gym. And there was a young man, probably mid-20s, in all black t-shirt, black shorts, and then like probably black sneakers. And immediately I was like, I was getting Ranger Battalion vibes. And then the third layer, and he was, again, young, athletic, tattoos, all black. And he was an amputee. He had lost a leg from the knee down. And I was like, 100%. This dude stepped on an IED and got cooked and survived. And because there were a bunch of Rangers that ran around the university that I was going to. And I had the audacity to go up to him and treat him like an absolute bro and was like, yo, bro, like, this is me. This is where I was at. This is what I did. Like, well, what's your story? Like, just treating him like an insider. And he was like, actually, man, I just got cancer and I lost my leg. I'm not a veteran. Like,
oh no,
no disrespect, but like, I just like black and like, I'm an amputee. And I was like, oh, like I felt I was so embarrassed. I was like, those
are the things that you remember at like 11:30 at night when you're trying to go to bed and you're like, did I get enough done today? Okay, so we need to kind of close off Rogers, and I think we've kind of gone through this arc. So one of the things about Robert Rogers that he illustrates that we are kind of getting to in this last leg of this chat was that his life didn't end very well. He didn't die in battle. There's no Valhalla for him. And unfortunately it reflects forward in history. At least that's what you alluded to. So there's pinnacle elements, there's key moments in Rogers' career where he defined himself as an excellent war fighter. We've talked about how that's adjusted the way that wars have been fought or influenced it. We've also seen a number of these bits. So what happens to Rogers? Like, who is he at the end of the French and Indian War? Because some of his lieutenants end up going to be part of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
What happens to him afterwards, and where does that come in here?
So it's really sad, and part of the reason why it's so sad is because it is so reminiscent of so many guys I know. I'm sure you know. Robert Rogers is a different man at the end of the war than he was at the beginning on so many levels. At the same time, the aspects of his personality that I wouldn't say corrupted him, but sort of haunted him, if you will, in the beginning, continue on after the war. There's like the French and Indian War is sort of a hiatus, and then he kind of goes back to who he was at the beginning. You know, and again, just to reiterate, before the French and Indian War, he was a frontiersman and he didn't know how to make money. He wasn't a very good farmer. He could not balance his finances. He was literally in debt his entire life. And what sort of made it even worse was during the war, very often the British High Command, this sounds crazy, but it's true, very often the British High Command could not pay his soldiers. And so Robert Rogers was having to literally pay these guys out of pocket or take lines of credit to pay them. And so he racked up this debt. And during the war, he just sort of assumed that at some point the British, you know, would pay him back for his services and make sure all of his guys were made whole again.
Yeah, and he clearly wasn't fighting for the money. That's just
right,
very,
no,
you know what I mean?
No, absolutely not. And you and I, good God, I know so many guys, and again, I'll get to this in a moment, but to this day, like I know guys that they just don't know anything else other than deployment, right? They joined special operations in the early 2000s and they're now pushing their 40s and into their 50s. They spend all their money. They've got bills to pay. They have responsibilities, but they have no other way of paying their bills other than doing what they have always done. And so they continue to just dig deeper and deeper and deeper instead of trying to find an exit strategy. And so that is essentially what happened to Robert Rogers in the aftermath of the war. He didn't have a purpose. He didn't have a place. His reputation shielded him, I would say, ever so slightly. So a good example of this is like at one point, I believe he was in New York City at the time. He was arrested. He was thrown in a jail cell. And some veterans of the French and Indian War, not even Rangers, just guys that like knew of his reputation, knew what he had done, were drinking in a tavern nearby, heard that he'd been arrested. And I can't remember what it was he was arrested for necessarily, but they basically drunkenly mounted their horses, went down to the jail cell, raided the jail, and then got him out of prison, and they stormed away because of his reputation. But the real important part of that sort of anecdotal story is that post-war, he was a criminal from time to time. In fact, he wrote two two books. One, I believe, was a play, and it was I think it was called, oh gosh, I'm going to screw this up. The play was called Pontiac, something like that. And it was about a Native American chieftain. It was sort of loosely based on a character or an individual that he had worked with. And he was trying to produce a play in order to make money. And he was trying to leverage his whole story that everyone knew, because during the war, he was a celebrity. So he was trying to use his celebrity status post-war, publish this play in order to make a little bit of money. Didn't really go anywhere. With that said, it's a fascinating piece of history. It gives us more insight on this Native American individual and Robert Rogers. As a sort of a side note, there's a lot of scrutiny that Rogers was a massive racist, that he hated Native Americans, that a lot of his aggression and violence towards Native Americans during the French and Indian War was due to the fact that, again, he was an Anglo, pseudo-European, white American, whatever, all that sort of crap. And the fact is that you can look at this one piece of literature that he wrote and see that he had a deep, deep love and respect for Native Americans, and he saw a lot of what happened to them as a tragedy. But just sort of to wrap this up.
Well, can I ask you?
Yeah,
I
please.
have a nope. I've got a pin. I've got in it. So finish what you're saying.
Okay, pin that. This is sort of the great ironies and beauties of the tragedy, the downfall of Robert Rogers. The reason we have his journals, which really memorialized him, which crystallized his position in history, was because he was broke. And he actually went to Europe, and Europeans wanted to hear more about, and obviously the British wanted to hear more about firsthand primary source experiences of the war. And so he wrote his journals 7 years after the war had ended. And so that's part of when you go back to study the journals, not all of it is totally historically accurate. And historians are good enough to go through and be like, he went on this reconnaissance. He claims there were 5 guys. Actually, there were 7. We know that from a letter that's closer to the time that it happened. Anyways, but we have his journals, and we have a lot of insight to Robert Rogers because he was just trying to make money to pay off his debt because he was so broke. Fast forward even further, and this is sort of the end of it. When the Revolutionary War kicked off, he went to George Washington and the Continental Army, as many of the Rangers had done. But because he had become such a seedy character over the course of the last 15 odd years or more, 20 years, whatever it was 15 years, Washington just didn't trust him. And he had his reasons. Like I don't fault Washington for that, but he viewed Rogers as a liability. And because Rogers only knew how to be a soldier, only knew how to be a ranger, for the first time in his later life, since the French and Indian War, since his celebrity, he saw an opportunity where, okay, I offered my services to this group. They said no. There's probably like a 50-50 chance or more that the British are going to be successful. There's no way these rebels are going to succeed. So I can just get paid and go work for these guys doing what I know and what I love and what I'm used to and what's familiar. I can go back to the war. And so he did it. And so I used to be, and this is the final note, but
he went to go work for the British.
Yes. Yeah. He fought for the British in the Revolutionary War. And this is something that often.
Was he effective in any capacity, or was he kind of not a spring chicken anymore? Because like, I remember that he did. I remember reading an account that he ended up going and fighting on behalf of the crown during the American Revolution.
He did. Yeah.
But there was no statement of what he accomplished. In other words, he didn't rout Washington at the Battle of, you know what I mean?
No, my understanding of his, and again, I haven't delved, to be completely transparent, I haven't delved too deeply in the intimate history of what he did during the Revolutionary War.
Gotcha.
But I would simply say that had he achieved a fraction of what he achieved during the French and Indian War, we would certainly know about it. Not to say he didn't do anything, but he more or less acted as he had during the French and Indian War for the British. Obviously, the British lost. He was a footnote in that conflict. A lot of people, as I've been producing these episodes, a lot of people bring this up in the comment section as if like I either didn't know about it or that I was ignoring it. It's not either. Like I'm aware that he worked for the British. He operated, whatever. He was a ranger for the British.
He sort of dies in infamy.
He literally dies. He has no children. He was married. He dies as a drunk. He's an alcoholic, and he sort of fades into history. And like he really peaked. And this is going to, I think, something that you sort of want to talk about probably. Tragically, he peaked during the French and Indian War. And the reason why I say it's a tragedy is because I know so many special operations guys who are haunted by their military career. And I don't mean like in the sort of quintessential victim PTSD way.
They're not having flashbacks about fireworks at night.
Yeah, right. No. But like you have guys and again, this is not at all to demean or attack in any way, shape, or form the guys who have done incredible things in special operations. But like a great example is there's one guy who in particular, I can't remember his name. He's incredible. I mean, he's brilliant. He was like 24 years old in the Vietnam War. He was an 18, what we would consider an 18 X-ray, and he was in MAC v SOG. And the shit he did is just like mind bending. And he was only in SF during the Vietnam War doing the MAC v SOG stuff for like 2 years. He like joined the army, went through training, was not shoved. He volunteered for being in special forces, went to Vietnam. I think he did 1 or 2 deployments, did a bunch of missions in Laos and Cambodia. I think he got shot at one point, or definitely got wounded. Anyways, he got out and then led a very, not milquetoast, but just like vanilla life. He became a journalist. He wrote articles for a local paper. And now in his later life, thank God, by the way, he's decided to go back and interview veterans from that time and memorialize their experience so that we have it forever. And like, it's one of the most, that of all of his achievements, honestly, I would say arguably what he's doing now may be even more important than what he did in Vietnam. But the point that I'm trying to make here is, you know, 2 years of his life as a mid 20-year-old defined the next 50 years. And that was certainly the case for Robert Rogers. It ended tragically, unlike this individual that I wish I remember his name. But again, like so many special operations guys, me included, there's not a day that goes, and this isn't like a boo-hoo, whatever. There is not a day that goes by that I don't miss it, that I don't think about it. I mean, I think about Afghanistan every day, but I don't mean that like I wake up screaming, sweating. Like I don't know if I miss it is the right term, but like it defines so much of who I am, much like the World War II veterans, Vietnam veterans, you know, OEF, OIF guys. Like it is just so much a part of you. And some guys can figure out a way to leverage that and hone it and direct that energy towards something else. And then other guys can't, or sometimes it's delayed and then, you know, it resurfaces. But for Rogers, he could never overcome, like that was his pinnacle. That was his peak. And it was incredible what he achieved.
Yeah.
But he would never live up to it again. And his life ended in tragedy. I don't think he was a traitor so much as just like, and this isn't an excuse, he just didn't know what else to do. Like that's what he knew.
Yeah. I wonder if you could put it that way. If you want to talk in the language of like the kids, like game appreciates game is probably a way of saying it. But I mean, that's not really the issue is like, I completely understand why he would do that. It doesn't in our oversimplistic moralizing framework, there's it just kind of, how do I put it this way? It's a rubric. I think that's a rubric because you understand he is up against the wall where he has had an unsuccessful life since the, you know,
total failure.
Yeah. I mean, he's, it's not that he's broken and unreadable, that he's losing his mind. It's that, well, maybe he is losing it, but it's like, you know, that's his world. I don't think I hesitate to talk about celebrity that way because I don't really see that. I see that as a small example. Some people are obsessed with their own celebrity, and you know what? It's tragedy. It's tragedy, and it very oftentimes, you know, when I see veterans who or people in that kind of scenario who like they want to get back into the game, they're not interested in going and being famous and popular again. They want to go back to an environment where what they do supposedly matters.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Purpose. They want purpose again. They want community. They want meaning. They want purpose.
It might be purpose. It might be community. I think you can. I think the military is in. I think the brotherhood, the brotherly love of, or the brotherhood, and that sense of camaraderie that's illustrated in the military actually comes more afterwards, where it is people noticing and signaling and spending time with each other and having some like common language. I don't think a lot of that happens while people are in. I think it's created there, but it produces itself afterwards.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. The military is the nest with the egg that hatches later to some sense of camaraderie. So if you're joining the military for camaraderie, you're not going to find it, dude. You're not going to find it in the way that we think we are. You're going to find it. But
and by the way, post-military, if you maintain that sense of community when you get out of the military and you make an effort to connect with those guys, and whether it's guys you worked with or other veterans that maybe you had no experience, whatever, that's a success story. Because personally, I don't, and this kind of breaks my heart to say this, but like, I don't talk to any of the guys that I deployed with, like, ever. I don't reach out to them. They don't reach out to me. Yeah, it is what it is.
I wonder how common that is. I really do.
Yeah, and to your point, like the sense of brotherhood, it exists, and I think for a lot of guys, it continues to exist. But just as many, if not more, when they get out, once you're out, you're out. Like, you're gone. And
I'll put it this way: don't take it for granted, and don't take it as it's. Don't assume that it's going to. You're gonna. To someone who's looking to join the military, don't assume that you're gonna have camaraderie. You have to cultivate it.
Yeah,
you have to cultivate it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So the pin, I guess I don't know if the pin is really all that important. This is as a fast, like, if this is a one-word answer. When you were talking about Robert Rogers, you had to take a moment to pause to explain about how he wasn't the racist that everyone is describing him as.
Yeah.
So, and you and I live in a timeline where everything has to be racist because it's the only way to sell a book now, or it's the only way to, and I think of it as it comes across as like a really odd problem. So the question is, do you think that when people in the next couple generations look back at our era of the historical writing where everyone was obsessed with whether or not X was a racist, whether or not they were, so we could erase them from this book or put them in that list or whatever, do you think future historians are going to look back at this time and basically scrub all that work, throw it away, and have to scrub the work of all of this like racism bullshit? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
because,
I do.
Right? Because like
it's super problematic.
Well, it's not super problematic. It's just that, like, there are people who still believe in this thing called like the 1619 Project, right? We talked about revisionist history in the past, and like, and you talked about you kind of gave this longer form explanation of some things that happened in history, whether it was like Spartan worship versus Spartan denigration versus this versus that, and it's and like right now you just because of the time that we live in, you had to like stop and pause in the middle of your description on Rogers post military or post 7 years war life to explain that he wrote a play about about a Native American guy and how like the current accusation is that he's a racist. And my only thought on this one is like, we're talking about special operations. I don't care if the dude was a racist. I don't. It doesn't change whether or not he was effective at what he did, unless it's relevant to the story. I'm not sitting down and having a moral evaluation of every decision that this guy makes. But it doesn't, so like, because what I'm not trying to learn from Robert Rogers's life on, say, how to properly treat other people of different races. I'm trying to figure out small unit tactics and unconventional warfare.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like, and I guess to kind of close off my rant, there's a certain level of like intellectual weakness. Is not the right word. The kinds of people who are convinced by the 1619 Project are the kinds of people who should not be allowed in academia. You just don't have you literally don't have the intelligence to comprehend it, because someone can write a comic book and you assume it to be history. Sorry, dude. You just don't. You do not have the chops. You don't have the material. And maybe we think of it this way. It's like I think of it the same way with a selection process. If you go to selection and you can't do the 48 push-ups required, look, you're not that doesn't mean that you're evil. It just
You
means
still have the chops.
this environment isn't for you, right?
Yeah.
And so, and so I like kind of tying that all back down together and going into the post-war life of Rogers it's a historical example of what I think so many people are experiencing today. And part of me, like where I'm stuck with this is I'm frustrated because the first thought that follows after it is, and I don't know what to do about it. Right.
Yeah.
And it's because this story is so common where you have some guy who joins the military. He goes up, like you could even say to some science, in some sense, it's my own. But there's others involved. There's other people that I'm not alone in this case, where they join the military. They have this experience. They in reality, in retrospect, they accomplish a lot. They become a PJ. They become a TAC P. They become a Ranger. They become a Green Beret. And then they leave the military after a certain period of time. Maybe they're a little disillusioned. Maybe the thing that they were sold or that they believed, maybe it wasn't even pitched to them, was that, this being a Ranger will fulfill that sense of identity crisis that you're encountering.
Right.
But then they get out and there's just nothing left. It's, there's just, the world just doesn't have taste anymore. I don't know how to put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things to sort of touch on.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, when it comes to history, the study of history, how we grapple with, frankly, what I see as the last 50 years of literature on just a wide array of topics. So I'll give you an anecdotal example. When I went back to school, I knew I liked history. It was just something that I was interested in. So I gravitated towards it like any other subject. And the university that I was at, it didn't matter if I studied ancient Greek history. I remember I took a class called Merchants, Pirates, Slaves. That was all about the Atlantic trade in the 16th century to like the 18th century through the prism of merchants, pirates, and slaves. I took a class on American history, multiple classes. It didn't matter what history class I took. It could have been any one of them from any part of the world or any moment in time. It was, I don't know if this was pre-planned by the university. I don't know if it was just coincidence. Looking back, I don't think it was. The last lecture of every one of these classes, with a few exceptions, but I would say 95% of them, the professor took the last class and attempted to take the whole semester's history lessons, if you will, and wrap it up in this ball of, and this is why free market capitalism doesn't work, and this is why we need to pivot towards a more socialist economic superstructure here in the United States.
Yeah.
And they would talk about that for an hour, and it was systematic. Like, it was every single class.
And you could predict it, and you sat in one, and you knew exactly what he was.
I knew it was coming.
Jordan Peterson talked about this a long time ago, where he said, someone's an ideologue when you know their words, what words they're going to say before they do. And
right. And
I'm sure
every history class I ever took.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've met people like this though, where it's like, and that's his next phrase, and that's his next phrase.
So going to one of the questions you had, which is like, what do we do with the history, or what will be done with the history that we've written now? How do we discard it? What do we do with it? I've sort of found ways of working around it. So I'll give you a good example. So I'm studying right now the reconquest of Spain in the early medieval period to the sort of 13th, 14th century. If I'm reading a book that was written after 1985, I'm basically anytime there's sort of, and you, like you said, there are these lines, these phrases, these words that they use that are clearly like politically motivated, if you will.
Yeah.
I'm just like, okay, ignore it. But what's fascinating is if I pick up a history book that was written in the 1970s or before, I almost never run into it. It is purely just like, here's
Okay.
what I know, here's what happened.
Yeah, so I'm reading a book on the French Revolution right now that was written in 1890,
Mm-hmm.
which by a Frenchman. So that's interesting. It's interesting seeing the difference in writing styles.
Yeah.
You know, and how he talks about the French Revolution because he wasn't there, but you know, you get that point. So that's one. And I was reading a really good example of what you're talking about. Is I was reading a book called How Civil Wars Start. I think that was it.
Yeah.
How or Why, and this is a number of years ago, and it's by Barbara F. Walters. Barbara F. Walter. And you could take a paragraph, and you see this very oftentimes where you take a paragraph and it would be, you know, you'd have these sentences, and sentence one would be an is statement. It'd be fact, 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 very blatant aggressive opinion.
Yeah, all the time. Yeah.
Fact.
Yep.
Fact.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, okay. That's, you know, like, and I wonder if they know they're doing that. I wonder if she knew she was doing that, because it was like, and it would be, and this is going to be couched in our political terms, just so people kind of get it. It would be like, roses are red, violets are blue, Trump is a racist, cars drive fast. You know, it's like, okay. Yeah. And you're like, you know,
I've got a really good example of this. I was reading a lot of the literature on Native American history that was produced in the last 20 years, if not in the last 30 years, is written this way. Where
are we still in like the Noble Savage era? Or are we still in?
No. So we've gotten to a point now where historians recognize that they if they're being somewhat honest, they can't come out and try to manufacture this narrative that Native Americans, like actual no shit historians, they can't get away with saying like Native Americans were totally innocent until the Europeans arrived. So they can't really, you know, they can't utilize this sort of noble savage Rousseauian concept. But what they will do, and I find it to be absolutely grotesque, is when they are talking about warfare engagements between Europeans and Native Americans, anytime a European does something, much like the St. Francis raid by Robert Rogers and his Rangers, they will use words and adjectives and descriptors to make it sound like not only genocide, but massacre is the term they love using more often than not. You know, it was horrific. They targeted, everyone died. It was terrible and awful, and it was you know, unimaginable.
Yeah, then ripping the heads off of babies and all, you know, whatever.
It's like, and like it's not even so much the intimate details. It's just like they put, like I said, they put motivating factor. They're like, Robert Rogers targeted St. Francis because he hated Native Americans. End of story. But then what they'll do in the same book is when they talk about Native American tribe versus Native American tribe, as they are at war with one another, doing, by the way, far more grotesque things, they won't use the same language.
Yep. Like, yeah, this is common.
They won't amplify like, yeah, they targeted civilians, and they'll sort of gloss over it instead of going into the detail of like, they killed all the men, they castrated them, they raped the women. Here's a really good firsthand account of what that looked like and felt like. And then also any children under the age of 5, they murdered them on site. And if there was an infant, you know, whatever, trigger alert for those of you who are listening, one of the most infamous ways that many Native Americans would dispose of infants was they would grab them by the feet. And this is both European infants and any Native American, any captured infant, they would grab them by the feet and literally just bash their heads against a tree or a rock until they died and dispose of their body. Like that was like super common all throughout North America.
Yeah. There is no value for human life represented. There's no value for human life replicated in at least from a Western framework, what
Exactly.
the Native
Yeah.
Americans did.
And
Yeah.
I could spend an hour talking about not excusing that behavior, but explaining like why they were doing those things.
The worldview that they held, which gave justification.
All kinds of stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge, if you want to know more about it, by the way,
War Before Civilization. All right.
This is the best book on the topic, and nobody reads it. No one knows it exists. If you want to know more about this, this is the book. It's a quick read. It's like 150 pages.
Are you keeping the sticky note business in you do sticky notes in your books? I do note cards with writing, and I write in my margins.
I actually stopped. It was too tedious. I just underline, earmark the page, like whatever. Turn to the corner of the page, and then I'll write a note in the margins. But that was so tedious.
Yeah, I write the margins, and then I always add a note card that is like key points and pages, so I can find it.
Yeah, no, that's smart. That's the best way to do it. I'm just too lazy to do that.
No. It's like it's a process. Anything over time. So yeah, I think I want us to. We need to wrap this up. We've been on this for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and so I think we're starting to not necessarily spiral out of control, but I want to kind of tighten it back into. We're talking about Rogers, the consequences post-war. And then we went into like history and really the one thing that I'm kind of laughing at is the question that I had is, do you see an example? Maybe that is a dark warning of what. So Roger, in the beginning of our conversation today, Rogers became a captain because he enlisted 28 men to go fight on behalf of the king.
Yep.
So all of a sudden he has a place, he has a title, he has something. He expected, he did something which I think a lot of us veterans do, a lot of us people in this category do, is like, if I do the right things, if I perform well in my job, if I accomplish the thing, if I finish the selection process, if I go on the deployment, you know, the big army is going to take care of me. Right. And it doesn't. And perhaps more importantly, it can't do that. Yeah. So we're in our age, what is the equivalent of the Rangers? Because they're not a military group, they're a paramilitary group at the time. Yeah. You know, they're not a military group, but they're working with the military. They're largely a civilian population. Yeah. They're not civilian. They're not regulars. They're very distinctly referred to not as regulars. Yeah. They're elite. They're the cowboys. But who is it today? Because if you were to take that metaphor, that example, it doesn't apply to modern Ranger Battalion. It doesn't apply to Green Berets. It doesn't apply to Delta Force. It doesn't apply to the Navy SEALs. It doesn't apply to MARSOC, because all of those are the regulars realizing that they need to recreate the other guy's capabilities. You know, those are all still regulars now. Well, they're many of them most of them probably started their careers in a standardized infantry platoon. Mm-hmm. You know, Rangers are different. You go straight to Ranger Battalion. You got the X-ray 18 X-ray program, but fundamentally, what's really interesting is the trajectory of special operations history, because for all of human existence, when you had these sort of quote unquote specialized units, they were frowned upon. Nobody really liked them in the regular army. They were disgusted by their behavior. And this, by the way, if this sounds familiar, it's because it still kind of exists in some way, shape, or form in the military. It absolutely 100%. Exists today. And it's a two-way street. But yeah. But what's happened is, like, normally, even in American history, by the way, after the conflict, you would dissolve those units. So after World War II, this was very obvious. Like, they had specialized units, and then once the war ended, they're like, okay, there's no use for you. Go, would just dissolve. The command dissolves. Everybody goes back to their routine. Yada yada. And then after World War II, this across the board, both in the United States Army and in the U.S. Navy, the high command were still disgusted by these types of individuals, but they recognized, we're like, wait a minute, we actually should like standardize this in some way, shape, or form, so that in the event, because the presumption after World War II was, we don't know this or we forget this, the assumption by the US government was that
you know, we did World War One, we did World War Two. We're going to do World War Three. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. And oh, by the way, it's not Nazis. It's not the Japanese. It's not the Germans, because we've locked down that entire country. It's the Soviets. We have to, you know,
the Cold War.
The Cold War. Well, and at the time, we didn't think it was going to be a Cold War. We thought it was going to be a hot war. We assumed that the Soviets were going to invade Germany and Europe, and then we'd be back in the same sort of thing again. And so what they did was they were like, well, you know, when the OSS were doing those unconventional warfare operations where they were assisting a resistance force behind enemy lines, man, that was really useful. Like, we got a lot of really good intelligence to prepare the invasion. Maybe instead of waiting to be in a shitty situation, we should anticipate it and just stand up a unit that can facilitate that mission. And so a bunch of OSS guys either went to the CIA or they were in the Army and they started Special Forces. And that's where Special Forces started. And the mission started, which was in the anticipation that they would basically just have to go back to France and do the French resistance again. And then it just never went away, and it was standardized. And then throughout the Vietnam War, 80s, 90s, into today, the US military began to realize that, you know, when you take an individual or group of individuals that was just a different caliber and class versus the rest of the military, you know, you could do more with one guy than you could do with 100 guys. And better yet, if you could take 10 of these sort of specialized guys, they're more capable than a battalion of guys. So let's harness that. Let's leverage that. Let's utilize that. You know, as far as where those guys go when they get, it's kind of funny now that I think about it. I think there is a better infrastructure post-military experience for conventional jobs in the military across the board than there is sort of a safety net, so to speak, for special operations guys. And I think maybe part of it, and I'm speculating here, but I think maybe part of it has to do with the fact that, like, of course, and just as a caveat, like, yeah, you have the Green Beret Foundation, you have all these different whatever fundraising groups and chapters within Special Forces, that clubs that they go and they whatever. I don't know any guy that's been a part of that. That was a thing that existed in the Vietnam era. I'm sure some guys still tap into the sort of SF chapters throughout the country. I am not a part of them. I don't know any of my friends that are a part of them. It just isn't a thing. But I do know and have seen people that have gotten out of the military from the conventional side, and they have clubs, they have community, they have continuity, they have connection. They like go to like annual dinners and whatever. And I just don't see that same thing in the special operations community. I don't know why that is. I don't know where that comes from, but there is some, I think, at least for me, like, when I first got out, there was this sense of like, I don't need community. Like, I'm a Green Beret. Like, I don't need support. I'm good on my own. I'm fine. I'll figure this out. I'm smart enough.
Yeah.
I'll go get the education. I'll go get a 6-figure job. I'll kill it. I'll leverage what I did in SOF into the private sector. And just anybody listening that's getting out, maybe, like, brother, I'm still figuring it out. And it's been 15 years since I got off, not 15 years, but a long time since I was active duty. So,
yeah. No, I get it. I'm there. I know that story. I know that story well, because I think I have a similar experience in that matter of, like, I kind of figured that I was going to get out of the military, do a little bit of this, do a little bit of that, get my degrees, and then kind of, for the lack of better words, settle down into a normal life.
Yeah.
That never happened.
No.
Nope, never happened. Now we can discuss on why how it affects, like, the special operations people, whether it's their demeanor that's required to get in, or the environment that they're at, or whether it's like, there's a big difference between me, like, maybe when you were giving the description, you're saying, like, you're not sure why there aren't any, like, special operations groups hanging around. And I think the simple answer is because we simultaneously want it, but think it's cringy.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think that's definitely part of it for sure.
it's this. I think it's this thing in tension where it's like, ah, man, you know, it's the same thing as like when you see the guy who's like so gray, man, that he sticks out.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? He's got the paracord bracelet and the, you know, like the he's just so gray, man. And
turbo.
you know, and he's trying to be so gray, man, that like
You're standing out. Ironically, you're standing out.
you're ironic,
highlighting
yeah,
yourself.
you're ironically standing out because
Yeah.
you know you've got the polo and the cargo pants or whatever it is, you know, whatever the current
Yeah.
thing is, the you know, it's like, and really the thing that gives you away is that you're obviously uncomfortable in your own body right now because you're trying to like not be who you've been for the last 5 years. So
Well,
fine, we'll be that way.
I just thought of something that I wanted to bring up earlier, and it's totally integrated in everything we were talking about. I think the modern version of Robert Rogers is Billy Waugh.
Yes, I was going to
And
go there. Yep.
and what's funny about Billy is that if you are in the community,
Yeah.
he is an absolute, like, legend doesn't even begin to describe this guy's
Yep.
accomplishments and career. In 150 years, he will be a footnote in from Soft. And unless you are in the community, you'll probably never hear his name or his accolades and what he's done and what, you know.
I knew a guy. Nope. I knew a guy who had never stepped foot in our community. Well, no, he did for a while. I'm going to have to disregard that.
But
yeah,
he, I mean, and this is not a critique at all. Like I wanted to be Billy Waugh. I still want to be Billy Waugh. Like I was listening to a show the other day where they brought him up and I was like, I wish maybe I'll just go back and like, I'll find a new war to fight or something.
Yeah.
And I can just be just like him. Like he is the guy.
Yeah. But Annie Jacobson writes about, he was in Mac v. Sog, right?
Every conflict ever. And you go back and if you read Jawbreaker, if you read Kill Bin Laden, like he was just like would pop up and be like, oh, I'm here. Like, and then, you know, Thomas Greer, who is the CAG operator who wrote Kill Bin Laden, he talked about how he ran into Billy when he first got into Afghanistan post 9/11, like a week later, and then he accidentally bumped into Billy in Iraq like 5 years later. But the thing about Billy is he presumably could have had a very different life. He could have taken all of that motivation and energy and spirit and started a company and made hundreds of millions of dollars, presumably, because clearly he was a brilliant man. He was independent.
We're not motivated by money.
But this is just the thing. Like, this is the funny thing is like, he was literally a soldier of fortune. Like there are just people who exist. And this is the question. And I don't know that there's an answer. There are so many guys from the Soft community. And I want to believe that I'm a member of this community that exists, but also to suggest that would just be flamboyant and ridiculous. And I feel so silly saying and cringe saying that. But there's some, I don't know what it is. I don't know if you're born with it. I don't know if it's environmental, but there's something that happens to an individual, a young man, that he wants to be a soldier more than anything. And we now exist in a world for the first time, thank God, it's kind of a gift, in human history where there isn't a war to fight, which throughout human history, like that wasn't the case. Like if you were a soldier in the 14th century, guess what? There was a war every 2 years, or there was a 30-year war or a 20-year war. Oh, there's no war, but we got to go do a raid on this fucking castle over here. And now we live in this world where we are, you know, again, thank God we live in this safe world.
We're even a small fraction of our military have even seen combat.
Right. Or even, and like, you know, all anybody wants in special forces, and I talk to guys that are in right now, like they are so desperate to get accidentally dropped into Africa or South America on a JSET or a foreign internal defense mission, and like someone just to ambush them so they could just like have that moment, right?
Yeah,
that
the validation.
They saw, yeah, right, exactly. And so again, like it's this weird, in a way, it's kind of, it's tragic.
I think I think there's some tragedy to it. I think there's some diagnosis that could happen.
Yeah.
For sure, because yeah, you're right. Like, Billy, the story on Billy Waugh that I understand or remember is that for a while he went to go work for in the post office for 5 years. You
Oh, I
know,
didn't know that.
he was so this is like after Mac the Sog, he becomes like a mailman for 5 years and
I didn't know that. Yeah.
describes it as like the worst 5 years of his life, and then he goes back to war. So
Which
it's
is
like,
amazing that he made that pivot, because it's not easy to go a year um, and not do the stuff and try to reinsert yourself. And what he was able to do, going from an SF 18 series guy, SF guy, and then effectively, like, from what I understand, like, ran or was a part of running the agency paramilitary organization to run clandestine or covert operations throughout the 80s and not like to pull that off. Like, I don't know how he did that. Like, I know there are books and it probably explains it, but like, you just can't do that today unless you're in a really specific situation. You have a very special background and connections.
well, we do have to understand we're referring to a single person, and so
Right. Yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's the Pareto distribution. It's very few people will have the opportunity to do very many things in this category. There's
Right.
and we might want to invade not invade. We might want to have to. Well, we're not going to do it, but there's maybe a soul searching that needs to go on with like where one places their value. Because it's reality. I mean, you join the military and you want to go be validated. You get in the Ranger Battalion, you want to go to war, and then the war ends, and you're like, well, what did I do this for? I missed the boat.
I talked to a guy the other day about this. He's been in Ranger Battalion for 5 years.
You couldn't have chosen when you were born, but you can choose with what you do.
And this is one point I want to make, and we can move on or shut it down. But last time we sort of talked about it and then moved on to something else. And I think it's really important to understand, at least personally, the guy that is willing to go enlist in the military and then go to Ranger Battalion or go to SF or go to CAG or whatever, Navy SEALs, whatever it is, and he might have a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year career where he doesn't deploy, he has no combat experience. I personally respect that guy just as much as the guy who was in Iraq in the early days or was in Afghanistan. And the reason I say that is because, yes, the guy that actually got to go and deploy and be in combat, he's quote unquote proven himself, whatever you want to call it. But the fact of the matter is like, so much of this is luck.
It is. And it's a hard thing to accept.
And it just like, it's out of your control. Like, the best that you can do is put yourself in a position where you've volunteered to do a job, you've proven to a community or an organization that you can do that job, and now it's just a matter of time and place. Are you in the unit when the unit happens to go to war? Yes or no? No? Well, you just don't get that experience. But that doesn't mean, I mean, the question that I always ask myself is like, how many Billy Waughs are out there that we just never knew about? Meaning they didn't get the opportunity to prove themselves in war. Like, how many Robert Rogers existed along the frontier that just, they were born in 1971, right? And the French and Indian War ended, and by the time they got to the point where they could actually go and fight, it didn't work out. And they were an effective fighter. They could have
in 1771. Okay, sorry. You said 1971. I was like,
oh, I'm sorry. No, 1771. Yeah.
Yep.
But like, I mean, I joke with a buddy of mine, and I'm sure everybody in the community does this, but like, we'll watch a show or a movie or Band of Brothers, and we'll kind of look at each other and be like, if only I was born in 1917, and then I came of age in World War II, and I got to be a part of the 82nd or the 101st or whatever. Like, I was born in the wrong time. But like, so again, so much of that is just, you weren't, and it's not your fault, and that's okay. And we shouldn't look down on guys who were in Ranger Battalion that didn't get to go to Iraq or Afghanistan. Like, they are just as good of a soldier, presumably, than any one of us, right? And it sucks.
Yeah,
and
as in, like, there's not the moral conviction. One thing that I will, I kind of have to lean in is, like, you're seeing the bones of the community, the club on display, where I recognize that someone who maybe is in battalion or in my circle, right, who didn't deploy is of no less value at all. Right. But for a time that gets brought up as a rubric. It's not absolute. And it's funny because it comes across as in these like, we want clean, hard rules where, going back to a video game reference, you have the experience points, so you have the thing. You finished you finished the level, or you got the special weapon because you beat the special dungeon or whatever it is, right? Like whatever it is, so, and those are hard and fast rules. Whereas, whereas in our environment, it's different. It's not exactly that strict, because
it's not cut and dry.
It's not cut and dry because if someone has combat experience, their opinion on a subject revolving around combat is generally going to be viewed higher. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be assumed to be correct. And
it shouldn't be assumed to be higher. Like
it shouldn't be, but you step 1 foot outside of our environment, and it's all of a sudden, oh, he's a combat veteran, he must know what he's talking about, and he's like,
well, this is not to go totally off topic, but this is a huge point of discussion and disagreement in the shooting community right now, which is, how many veterans, particularly from special operations, have got out and, God bless them, they don't know what else to do, so they start a tactical shooting course. And now there's a huge pushback a legitimate pushback, I think, of guys who are, no shit grandmasters at USPCA. It's what they do. Yeah. And, or IPSC, whatever. I don't compete. I want to compete. It's on my list of to do. But there are these guys who like do it for a living, and they're looking at all these tactical bros coming out, and they're like, guys, like, this is all wrong. Like, this is not how you do this. And then and so now there's this flood, this like huge wave and pushback against, like, I don't care if you were a Navy SEAL. I don't care that you deployed 10 times to Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't care if you have a Bronze Star medal. I don't care about, what can you do today? Like, let's get on the range. I got a timer. Let's see what you can do. And a lot of these guys, for a whole host of reasons, cannot perform in the way that we would assume they can perform or should perform. And so going back to what you were saying about having that combat action badge or whatever, the CAB or the CIB, like that could, like, I saw, this is like a whole longer conversation, but I've seen some influencer guy who has like millions of followers, and he's somehow still an officer. I don't want to call him out by name, but like, he's still an officer in the active duty Army, and he's somehow like a huge influencer and like is clearly making money in other ways, shape, or form, which I don't know if that's, you're supposed to do that or you should do that or whatever. There's a lot of questions there.
Once you reach a certain level, then the machine, like, the machine will stomp down the small trees. But once you get past a certain height, it's kind of hard to cut you down.
But he has I've seen him in uniform, and again, I don't like to talk about this stuff because I don't really care, but I've noticed he has a combat action badge. And then I sort of like scrolled through his stuff, and I'm like, wait, hold on a sec. You were in this unit and you deployed at this time. No one was in combat at that time. Like, no one was doing anything at that time. And so for you, in order for you to have gotten that, there had to have been a situation where, like, you were on you were in Kandahar on the air base or Bagram or whatever. You were like going to Burger King with your buddies after intramural soccer, which is like all things that are happening at that time. And like an RPG went off and hit a wall, like, a click away from you, and that qualified you to get a cab. And so to your point, like, they see this guy, this officer that has this citation or this award, and they assume like, oh, this guy is a subject matter expert on what it's like to be in combat. And in actuality, like, he was just like kind of there, and his command was like, we're handing out these awards. So it's like,
you get
it
an
means
award. You get
nothing
an award.
almost.
Oh, you're an
Yeah, yeah.
officer. Yeah, there was a random gunshot fired in the last in a nautical mile, so you get a CIB. But your private who just literally matrix dodged an RPG does not get one because it didn't technically scratch him. So
We had weird, again, like I hate to talk personal stories and I won't get into the details, but there were multiple situations where like on my when I was in Afghanistan, I technically met the threshold of like, okay, you've met the Army standard for getting a CIB. And my team sergeant was like,
nope,
no, I'm not going to give it to you. Like, you haven't done it yet.
Nope.
You haven't earned it. And there was this one moment, so to speak, where it was sketchy. And we got back, we got home back to base that night, and he was like, okay, you earned it now. And I was like, like finally, geez.
Oh,
like,
Gibbs CIB. Can I have
it was like such a big deal, and I was so excited. But it was one of these
exciting.
where, it was just funny the way we had how many conversations where it was like, you haven't earned it. I know this happened, but you haven't earned it.
Yep.
Yeah. But, that's just the way it goes. It's no big deal.
Yeah, and it's funny to see how, and maybe this is what we get to end on, is like, it's funny we see how there is this example of you have like USPSA grandmasters talking about, blah, 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 and maybe it's just the drama and it's just people talking on the internet.
Yeah, clickbait, yeah.
But people like their rage. They have to have it. Despite all my rage, I'm still just here making a Facebook page. But my point being said is, my point on that, the horrible, horrible dad joke, is that there's a difference between soldiering and shooting. There's a difference between fighting and shooting.
Well, this is where this conversation goes, is like,
right, and it's like
tactical guys are like, when you're on a flat range doing a stage, it's fundamentally different than combat. And then you get the guys who...
Yeah, but you know what combat is? Combat is PCCs and PCIs. You know what combat is? Combat is planning an infill route and having a separate exfil route. You know what combat is?
Yeah.
Combat is setting in your security before you hit the target building. It's like, and while this may sound like turning combat into something completely ambiguous, combat is when you're going to go shoot a match tomorrow, cleaning and oiling your guns and then making sure your zeros are on. If you know what I mean? Like,
well, so, yeah. And this is something, and again, I could have another 3-hour-long conversation.
Oh, we'll have a long time, but
I know, but I do want to make this point because I think it's really important.
Mm-hmm.
There's this bizarre idea or notion, particularly in, I guess it's most commonly referred to as the Second Amendment community.
Yep.
Where guys rightfully and understanding, like, I'm in full support of it. Like, you own a weapon, you should know how to use it. You should be proficient. Mm-hmm. I am all for it. Do it. You're 18 years old. Like, go for it. Like, I'm fully in support of that. The thing that drives me kind of crazy, though, and it's something that you sort of mentioned, is this idea that a lot of these guys, when they shouldn't have to explain away why they own these guns and why they like to shoot them. Like, who cares? Like, you're fulfilling your constitutional right. Like, you do you, man. Like, that's awesome. But whatever, they feel the need to explain themselves. And one of the things they say is like, in the rare event, in the rare moment that will likely never happen in my lifetime, I want to just best prepare for the event that, like, there's some kind of revolt and I have to protect my community or protect the United, like, the reason why the Second Amendment exists, right? I have to serve in a militia as a part of a paramilitary force because there is a fascistic leader who's not giving up power, yada, yada, yada. The thing that I want to say to those guys is like, okay, well, go get a compass, go get a map, wait till it's dark, get a rucksack that weighs 50 pounds, and I want you and your buddies, without communicating verbally to each other, to move across 3 clicks, 3,000 meters, going from point A to point B, and you're hitting certain checkpoints along the way. And oh, by the way, the point that you want to get to eventually, you have to get there at a very, very, very specific time. And if you don't get there at that specific time, mission over, you fail. Because the
It's a
fact of the
window.
matter is,
Yep.
the actual shooting component, and this is part of the reason why even today the military doesn't enforce, like, not everybody has to be an expert level marksman in the infantry. Like, as long as you know how to utilize your rifle well, that's good enough. Because the fact of the matter is, your capacity to implement your weapon or utilize your rifle, your M4, whatever it is, effectively is 3% of all of the skills you have to know in order to be a good soldier.
But ironically, it's the one thing that if you do it wrong, it's all over, you know?
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah. No, of course. And I'm not, again, like, this is not me suggesting that guys who are pro Second Amendment, like, I'm one of them. Like, I do dry fire in my office here all the time. Like, I enjoy doing it. I like doing it. I think it's important to do. I totally support guys. I think they should do it. I think by the way, if you want to learn how to be good at firing, whether it's pistol or rifle, bro, dry fire. Do it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure at least 50% of the people who listen to the show are dry firing regularly.
Yeah, good, so, great. You should continue to do that.
You're definitely talking to a microcosm. You know, this is not.
But also, like, go take a weekend, go buy a topographic map, and go walk around the woods. Because the fact of the matter is, like Robert Rogers taught us, 96% of soldiering is being absolutely miserable, being really, really hungry, and being able to function in that state of mind of pure exhaustion, but you still have an objective. You still need to get to a place and do a thing, right? In order to have a larger, both tactical and strategic impact on whatever sort of cause you are supporting, right? So by all means, keep doing your thing with the dry fire and the shooting. If you're doing competition shooting, like, great, do it. But also, like, if you're trying to prepare for you know, God forbid, a huge war or whatever it is, like, go learn the other things.
There's a long road that we can go down here, which is always going to be asking the question of what for, and that's the so you've got the skills, and we can play this almost like an infinite regress game, except for instead of an infinite regress, like, oh, so you know how to shoot? Well, do you know how to shoot at night? Do you know how to shoot at night? Do you have a kit? You know, do you have, you've got a kit, you know, do you have nods? Oh, you've got nods. Do you have like a vehicle, you know, or do you have a list of manuals? Like on the floor here, I have a light machine gun manual for the M249 series. Okay. Big flex, right? Do I have an M249? Maybe. No, I don't. But the point is like, you can kind of play this infinite game of, oh, you think you're here? Well, you should be here.
Yeah,
and
totally
I get
fair.
That.
Yeah.
You know, and I get that. And part of me with a little bit of humility understands, it's not, okay, I started that sentence completely incorrect because it's not with humility. Part of me understands that the veteran gets out. The only thing that he has that can't be done better than somebody else is teach combat things. He can teach, you know what I mean? Like you know what I mean? There is something unique about being in the military that is, so it's a societal expectation that you're like, oh, well, if he talks about war, that's okay because that's what he did, right? But also there's another part to it, which is it's perhaps the most unique element, because you can take a guy, we'll go into this example. You can take a guy, let's say you've got an infinite bank account. So now he can do whatever he's not bound by a 9 to 5. He can train all day, get in great shape, be able to shoot really well, skydive out of planes, carry kit, land navigate, all these things. He's got the land nav kit. He's got his own private airplane. He's got his own team. Nods, the whole thing, right? Gear, capabilities. He's in every way, shape, and form. He's identical to a SEAL Team 6 guy.
Sure.
But he's not in SEAL Team 6. You know what I mean? So what, you know, like, so the question is like, what for? What for? You know, if you could do that, if you can metaphorically snap your fingers and have all of the assets, all the support network, you've got your own chow hall, you've got your own blah, 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 but you're not a Navy SEAL, like what is it for? You're not going to go do a pre-dawn raid on the bin Laden complex in Pakistan because you're not a Navy SEAL. What is that thing that makes people different there? And
what now?
You know, what now? Or, and then kind of, so, and if you take that same idea and you apply it to the citizen, I understand that even myself being one now deals with the question of like, not what, yeah, it's kind of like, what for? What is all this for? What is all this, all this? And because I'm not much into the prepping side.
No, neither am I.
I'm not in that subcategory as much, but to someone who's outside of the environment, they might think I am, because I have more than one rifle or whatever, or what you could go down a whole long list of things, but there's still something that compels us to be here. And I think that shouldn't be, that needs to be addressed, or it can't be left unfettered. So,
I mean, to your point, like, like I said a moment ago, like I still dry fire, like I still do this. So like, why do I do? I'm not, the likelihood that I'm going to find myself in a moment of crisis where I'm going to have to utilize small unit. It's not almost, it's pale, like it's non-existent. But
unless you chase it out, unless you pursue.
Yeah, and like part of it, I think part of it is you feel, whether you're a veteran or a civilian doing this stuff, like part of it, it's a whole host of reasons. Like I think part of it is a sense of duty, obligation, responsibility. I think it's fun. Simultaneously, I think it makes individuals feel like they're certainly part of a community, particularly in an era where all of our community, or most of it, is in social media. So you see memes all the time of USPSA or whatever, the competition shooter guys, like talking shit about other guys, and you want to be in their group, and you feel like you're a part of that group, the cool guy group, the in group, if you're actually in your house with the stuff on the wall doing the dry firing, even though like no one knows you exist or that you're doing that thing.
Yeah.
But it still makes you have this sense of identity and participation, continuity. And again, like I do think there is certainly something to be said about individuals, like, again, not to go down a whole other rabbit hole here, but like if you own a gun, whether it's a rifle or a pistol, it is incumbent on you to know how to utilize it safely and efficiently. And like, I think that is absolutely critical. And that's something that was lost on the generations before us, where you kind of just collected guns and you would occasionally go shoot. Like, I think that's wrong. I think if you own one, you should be proficient with it. And it's a skill set that you lose.
And
right. Yeah. And by the way, like, I think competition shooting is awesome. I think there's this really, really cool, exciting thing that is happening right now where competition shooters, particularly veterans who are now GMs, grandmasters, are recognizing that law enforcement throughout the country is not where they need to be in terms of their marksmanship capabilities. And these are individuals who could at any moment need to utilize their weapon system, whatever you want to call them, pistols, rifles, whatever it is, on a daily basis all the time for 20 years, versus when you're in the military, that's not always necessarily the case. And so seeing that happen, I'm super excited. It fires me up. I am so excited that guys are taking to the streets and to social media and being like, hey, if you're in this department, like you have an obligation, responsibility to be dry firing 5 minutes every day. And if you can compete, go compete. So I think that's super. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like, so much of this in terms of why you own a gun and why maybe you're doing the dry firing or you're going to the range and spending money on ammo. I think there's so many different reasons, and all of them are valid. And I think it's frankly, like, it's exciting and I encourage it. I would also just say, like, hey, if you're doing it for the reasons of like protecting your country and Second Amendment, like take the time to figure out what are some other soldiering skills that you can complement with your shooting. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. And I think, and I'm seeing that soldiering skills are in vogue right now. Like, hey, great. Your draw times is you got a sub-second draw time. What's your 12-mile ruck at?
Not even 12-mile ruck. Like, just, can you ruck? Do you have a ruck? Have you tried?
Yeah. I'm being a little hyperbolic in that one, but it's just like, we're in a good time for that. And if we look past all the, the nipping at the heels, like it's an interesting time. I think
it's awesome. I love it. But I'm all for it.
And finally, like that whole paradigm, here's a question: when you're dry firing, are you wearing a black T-shirt with the logo and Vans? Because hey, you got to signal to the team.
I think if I am.
But my point, it's a joke. It's a joke. But my point is on that whole spiel is, for a while I think we address it within the framework of veterans very frequently. I wonder how much of this is outside of that. And people who've never served in the military are dealing with kind of the same thing, because you were talking about a difference in kind. You and I understand why Robert Rogers went to the Americans and then he went to the English. He's like, because I have one thing that I'm good at, and I want to feel like I'm doing something useful again. I want to be, it's like, I get it. Yeah, we might think of it as like, oh, you're not loyal to your country, but like, okay, dude, your country kind of just said, nah.
And also, by the way, from a historical perspective, the country was really just a handful of colonies that just didn't want to be bothered and taxed by the British. Like there was no homogenous, we are the United States.
Exactly. Yep.
It was a bunch of, colonists who were like, F this, like I'm tired of paying this king and having no representation. You want to buddy up and fight these jerks? Like, yeah, let's go fight these assholes. Like,
you're not gonna bully me anymore, you little red coat.
And we sort of backtrack and like from today being like America, and it was the founding of our country, but it was different. Like
George Washington himself had a vision that was the Constitution that came down on two eagles' claws, and while he was there in his seance, all of America came into one collective consciousness. None of that is true. But that's a hilarious example. Yeah. All right. Well, hey, Zach, where do people find you? How do we follow through? Like what's going on at the Dead Warrior Society? Let's do all that.
So I have a YouTube channel. I hate to say channel. I do a video podcast on YouTube, and then also you can listen to audio, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. I am actually, as strange as it sounds, I am actually trying to focus most of my energy on military history outside of the Western or American paradigm. And right now I'm just working on, I feel like I have to do it for reasons I won't get into. I'm doing a whole history on Special Forces Green Berets. It's going to be much longer than I anticipated. So that is coming up. And then I'm going to cover my next project is the Reconquest of Spain, the Crusades, and then the invasion of Mexico. And if you're into long form history podcasts, I'm probably your guy. That might be something you're interested in. So YouTube, Dead Warrior Society, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Yeah.
All right. Well, one thing that, so for those who caught you in this one thing that I appreciate about your episodes is that when you're describing something of military significance, you also incorporate the context. And so we're going back to the significance of the St. Francis raid was, I thought, when I got to the end of it, it made sense. Now, some of that might be because we do speak some of the military jargon, not really in your podcasts, but not in your episodes, but it is something that we do have a little bit of that common language. But it was intriguing to see so no one, this is why we call it ranging. This is where this comes from.
This term comes from, yeah.
This term, this makes so much sense now that when I went to Ranger school, we spent 10 days in a long movement with ambushes between and ambushes and patrol base activities. Like, oh, I get it now. It's not, ranging has nothing to do with kicking doors. I'm being facetious on that.
Well, that's why
that revelation came many years ago, but it was a good example of it. Like it.
When I was in the Army, I wanted people to explain why we're doing things, not what we were doing, and I wanted the underlying reasons. And I found that they were never willing to explain why we were doing what we were doing, and so.
And I am going to cut you off because that is a long
that's a whole thing. Yeah, no, totally, absolutely.
All right, Zach, thanks for jumping on. For those who are still listening, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast for the second appearance with Zach Masek. So it's great to have you on. And if you want to support the show, you can head over to redactedllc.com. We've opened up the store once again, as well as if you go to redactedculture.locals.com, you can just support us directly and keep the show running, the lights on, and more guests on the show. With that being the case, thank you for your time. Now go forth and conquer.
See ya.
I just wanna say